A CIA operative has disappeared inside Belarus. Officially, she doesn't exist. Non-official cover. Chapter 1. The tires chewed through the standing water on the asphalt. It was a vicious, hissing sound. Washington, D.C. was drowning in a November freeze. Sleet hammered the roof of the armored Cadillac. The ballistic glass of the windows was 3 inches thick. It distorted the city lights, turning the red taillights of the traffic into smeared, bloody streaks. Brill Wingfield sat in the back. The leather seat was cold against his spine. The air inside the cabin smelled of filtered ozone and expensive sandalwood cologne. Shelby Johnson sat across from him. Shelby was the head of Shadowboxer Solutions. He was a man who moved armies with a phone call. Tonight, he wasn't making calls. He was staring at the reinforced divider, separating them from the driver. Shelby's jaw was tight. His hands rested on his knees. The knuckles were pale. Brill watched him. He didn't speak. Silence was a tool. It forced other men to fill the void. The Cadillac banked hard onto the Arlington Memorial Bridge. The Potomac River below was a black, rushing void. The suspension of the heavy car absorbed the uneven pavement. Brill felt the subtle shift in momentum. Shelby reached into his bespoke charcoal suit. He pulled out a manila folder. It was thin, too thin for a standard briefing. He slid it across the polished wood of the center console. "Read it," Shelby said. His voice lacked its usual polished resonance. It was clipped, frayed at the edges. Brill didn't touch the folder immediately. He calculated the variables. A moving car. A thin file. A stressed handler. The mission was off the books. Way off. Brill picked up the folder. He flipped it open. A photograph was clipped to the left side. A woman in her mid-20s. Dark hair pulled back in a severe, functional bun. Pale skin. High cheekbones. Her eyes were a flat, unreadable gray. It was the face of a woman who knew how to blend into a crowd. A face designed to be forgotten. "Sarah Vance," Shelby said. Brill scanned the basic biometrics. 5'7", 130 pounds. Fluent in Russian, German, and Polish. CIA, Shelby added. Non-official cover. Brill closed the folder. He dropped it back onto the console. A NOC. The deepest end of the intelligence pool. No diplomatic immunity. No embassy fallback. If a NOC got caught, the government burned their file. They became a ghost. "Where is she?" Brill asked. "Minsk." Brill processed the geography. Belarus. A landlocked country squeezed between Russia and Poland. A dictatorship frozen in the Soviet era. Cold. Brutal. Unforgiving. "Minsk is a hard place to disappear," Brill said. "She didn't disappear," Shelby said. He looked away from the divider. He met Brill's eyes. She was taken. The Cadillac hit a pothole. The heavy chassis shuddered. "By who?" Brill said. "State security. The KDB. The locals still call it the KGB. They kept the methods. They kept the brutality." Brill knew the Belarusian KGB. They were not subtle. They operated out of a massive, yellow neoclassical building on Independence Avenue. They preferred basements. They preferred concrete walls and rubber hoses. They didn't take American spies for political leverage. They took them to extract information. And then they buried the remains in unmarked graves in the Karapati forest. "Was her cover blown?" Brill asked. "We don't know," Shelby said. She was working as a logistics coordinator for a German agricultural firm. Moving tractor parts. Boring. Invisible. She missed her primary check-in 48 hours ago. She missed the secondary 12 hours later. A local asset spotted her being shoved into the back of a panel van near October Square. Langley has extraction protocols, Brill said. Langley doesn't know, Shelby said. The words hung in the sterile air of the cabin. Brill watched Shelby's hands. The fingers twitched. A micro-expression of suppressed anxiety. This wasn't a government contract. This wasn't Pentagon business. Why do you care? Brill asked. Shelby let out a slow, measured breath. He smoothed the lapel of his jacket. The politician was trying to claw his way back to the surface. Her handler, Shelby said. He's an old friend. A contact from a long time ago. He saved my life in Beirut before you were even born. Shelby looked out the window at the freezing rain. He ran her off the books. She was tracking something outside her primary parameters. If he goes to the director now, she's dead. They'll disavow her instantly. They won't risk an international incident with Minsk over a rogue agent. Brill understood the math. A rogue NOC. A panicked handler. A blood debt owed by Shelby Johnson. It equaled a suicide mission. You want her back, Brill said. I want to know if she's alive, Shelby corrected. If she is, you get her out. If she's not, you confirm the kill. You sanitize the site. You leave nothing behind. They have her in a cell, Brill said. Minsk is a surveillance state. Cameras on every corner. Informants in every hotel. They lock down the borders the moment a foreign national goes missing. That is why I am sending a ghost. The Cadillac turned off the parkway. The tires crunched over gravel. They were heading into the industrial sprawl near Alexandria. Abandoned warehouses. Empty lots. The edges of the city where the light didn't reach. Brill ran the tactical landscape in his head. Belarus in November. Sub-zero temperatures. Constant sleet. Gray, brutalist architecture that offered zero concealment. He would need winter gear. He would need local currency. He would need a weapon that didn't jam in the freeze. What was she tracking? Brill asked. We don't know, Shelby said. Her handler received one encrypted burst transmission before she went dark. A single phrase. The pipeline is open. Arms, Brill said. Or drugs. Or people. Belarus is a transit hub. The KDB takes a cut of everything that crosses the border. Shelby reached into the seat pocket in front of him. He pulled out a thick, waterproof pouch. He dropped it on Brill's lap. The pouch was heavy. Brill unsealed the waterproof zipper. He pulled out a passport. Dark blue cover. Canadian. He flipped it open. His own face stared back at him. The name read David Corlett. The entry stamps showed recent travel to Frankfurt and Warsaw. It was a good fake. It felt right in the hand. Flight leaves Dulles in exactly 50 minutes, Shelby said. You're booked on a commercial cargo carrier to Warsaw. You'll be riding with a shipment of medical supplies. Brill reached back into the pouch. He pulled out a stack of banded currency. Euros. Thick and crisp. He dug deeper. His fingers wrapped around cold milled steel. He pulled it out. It was a Sig Sauer P365. Subcompact. Matte black. It had a threaded barrel. Attached to the barrel was an Osprey microsuppressor. The weapon was tiny, lethal, and virtually silent. It was a close-quarters executioner's tool. Brill dropped the magazine. It was fully loaded with subsonic hollow-point rounds. He slammed the magazine back home with a sharp, metallic clack. He racked the slide. The action was flawless. No official footprint, Shelby said. His voice was hard now. The handler was back in control. No backup. You do not contact the embassy. You do not use local American assets. If you are burned, Shadowboxer Solutions has never heard of you. You are David Corlett, a Canadian logistics auditor who made a fatal wrong turn. Brill engaged the safety on the SIG. He slipped the weapon into the waistband of his dark trousers at the small of his back. The cold steel pressed against his spine. How do I cross the border? Brill asked. From Warsaw, you take a train to the crossing at Brest, Shelby said. The guards on the Polish side are blind. The guards on the Belarusian side are greedy. 500 euros inside the passport will get you through the checkpoint without a scan. And if they scan it, then you don't cross the border, Shelby said flatly. You find another way. Or you abort. Brill stared at the manila folder on the console. Sarah Vance. Trapped in a concrete box, waiting for a rescue that wasn't coming. Waiting for a ghost. The Cadillac slowed. It rolled to a stop under the rusted awning of an abandoned textile factory. The engine idled. The rain drummed relentlessly against the steel roof. Shelby pressed a button on the armrest. The locks on the doors disengaged with a heavy, satisfying clunk. Find her, Brill, Shelby said. He didn't look at him. He stared straight ahead at the dark, rain-swept alley. Find out what she knows. Then burn the bridge. Brill didn't nod. He didn't say a word. He grabbed the waterproof pouch. He gripped the door handle and pushed it open. The cold hit him instantly. It was a vicious, biting wind that sliced through his jacket. The sleet stung his face like tiny needles of glass. He stepped out of the warm, leather-scented cocoon of the armored car and into the freezing darkness. He slammed the heavy door shut. The Cadillac didn't linger. The driver put it in gear, the tires spinning briefly on the wet gravel before catching. The red taillights flared, painting the wet pavement in a wash of blood-colored light. The car accelerated down the alley, merging back into the city traffic, disappearing into the storm. Brill stood alone under the rusted awning. The wind howled through the broken windows of the factory above him. He could smell wet concrete, diesel fumes, and the sharp metallic tang of the freezing rain. He felt the heavy weight of the suppressed pistol against his back. He felt the thick stack of euros in his pocket. He was a ghost, standing on the edge of a frozen hell. He pulled the collar of his jacket up against the wind. He turned away from the empty alley and began to walk toward the highway. The mission had started. The clock was ticking. He had 40 minutes to make a flight to Warsaw. He had to cross a border. He had to find a woman who didn't exist. He stepped out from under the awning. The sleet swallowed him whole. Chapter 2. The cargo bay of the commercial freighter smelled of aviation fuel, ozone, and the coppery scent of specialized medical equipment. It was a cavernous, echoing space, vibrating with the deep, throaty hum of the jet engines as the plane began its descent toward Warsaw. The lighting was dim and utilitarian, casting long, harsh shadows over the tightly strapped pallets. Brill Wingfield sat on the floor near the rear bulkhead, his back against a crate of dialysis machines. He wore a heavy, dark wool peacoat over his suit, his collar turned up against the chill that seeped through the aircraft's skin. The Canadian passport and the thick stack of euros were secured in an inside pocket. The suppressed Sig Sauer P365 was cold against his spine. He was David Corlett, a logistics auditor, a man who dealt in spreadsheets and supply chains, not clandestine rescues in hostile territory. The cover was thin, but it was all he had. He wasn't thinking about the cover. He was running the variables. Sarah Vance, NOC, held by the Belarusian KGB in Minsk. Her handler compromised, maybe even complicit. Shelby Johnson pulling strings to keep the operation off the books. The math didn't favor survival. Minsk was a fortress built on paranoia. The KGB operated with a brutal efficiency honed during the Soviet era. They didn't just arrest people, they disappeared them. And Vance had been missing for over 60 hours. The golden window for a clean extraction had closed. He had to assume she had been interrogated. He had to assume she was injured. And he had to assume the KGB was watching the borders, waiting to see who would come looking for her. The plane banked sharply. The pitch of the engines changed, a higher strained whine as the pilot deployed the flaps. Brill pushed himself up from the floor. He stretched, a series of precise, economical movements that loosened muscles cramped from the long flight. He checked his gear one last time. The SIG was fully loaded with subsonic hollow points. The spare magazine was in his left pocket. The small lock-picking kit and the encrypted satellite phone were in his right. The heavy cargo doors at the rear of the plane began to open with a slow, grinding hum, revealing a sliver of gray, overcast sky and the wet tarmac of Warsaw Chopin Airport. The cold, damp air of Eastern Europe rushed into the bay. He waited as the ground crew, bundled in bright yellow rain gear, maneuvered a cargo loader into position. He didn't rush. He moved with the tired, deliberate pace of a man who spent his life in transit. He walked down the metal ramp and stepped onto the tarmac. The wind was sharp, carrying the smell of jet exhaust and impending snow. He pulled the collar of his peacoat tighter and joined a small group of flight crew and ground personnel heading toward a side entrance of the terminal. No one paid him any attention. He was just another face in a tired crowd. Customs was a formality. He presented his Canadian passport. The border guard, a young man with bored eyes, scanned the document, barely glancing at Brill. He stamped it with a heavy thud and slid it back across the counter. "Business or pleasure?" the guard mumbled, already looking past him. "Auditing a shipment for a medical supplier," Brill said, his voice flat, unremarkable. "Business." He walked through the sliding glass doors into the main concourse of the airport. It was crowded and noisy, a jarring contrast to the silence of the cargo bay. He needed to move. He needed to get to Brest. He found an ATM and withdrew a handful of Polish zloty, then headed for the train station connected to the airport. The schedule board above the ticket counter flickered with changing times and destinations. A direct train to Brest, a city on the Polish-Belarusian border, was leaving in 30 minutes. He bought a ticket with cash and found a seat in an almost empty second-class car. He sat by the window, watching the gray sprawl of Warsaw slide past as the train pulled out of the station. The journey took 3 hours. Brill didn't sleep. He watched the landscape change from urban industrial zones to flat, snow-dusted farmland. The sky grew darker, the clouds pressing down like a heavy gray ceiling. He ran the scenario for the border crossing. Shelby had said the Polish guards were blind and the Belarusian guards were greedy. €500 inside the passport. It was a crude method, but bribery was the universal language of border control. But it was also a risk. If the guard was honest, or if he was being watched by a superior, the bribe would backfire. He would be detained. The mission would be over before it started. He had to be prepared for the worst-case scenario. As the train slowed on its approach to Brest, Brill took the stack of euros from his pocket. He slipped 5 crisp €100 bills into the pages of his passport, folding it so the edge of the money was just visible. He put the rest of the cash away. The station at Brest was a massive Soviet-era structure of gray concrete and arched windows. It looked cold and unwelcoming in the fading light. Brill joined the stream of passengers exiting the train. They moved with a hurried, purposeful energy, heads down, shoulders hunched against the biting wind. He followed the signs for the border crossing. The checkpoint was a long, low building that spanned the tracks. The air inside was stale and smelled of cheap tobacco and wet wool. There were 2 lines. One for EU citizens, one for everyone else. Brill joined the second line. The process was slow. He watched the Polish guards check passports and wave people through. They were thorough, but they didn't look for trouble. He reached the front of the line. The Polish guard, an older man with a gray mustache, took his passport. He glanced at the photo, then at Brill. He ran the document under a scanner. It beeped, a soft green light indicating approval. He stamped the passport and handed it back. Brill walked past the Polish checkpoint and entered the no-man's land between the two countries. It was a short walk, maybe 50 yards, but the atmosphere changed instantly. The lighting was harsher, the concrete floors dirtier. The Belarusian checkpoint was a serious affair. Heavy steel gates. Armed guards in olive drab uniforms. The KGB presence was palpable. There was only one line. Brill joined it. The man in front of him, a nervous-looking businessman clutching a worn briefcase, was sweating profusely. Brill watched the Belarusian guard working the booth. He was young, his face sharp and angular, his eyes cold and calculating. He examined every passport with meticulous care. He asked questions. He made people wait. He wasn't a man who looked like he took bribes. He looked like a man who enjoyed his power. Brill calculated the odds. The 500 euros in the passport. The young, aggressive guard. It was a bad combination. He had to adapt. He reached into his pocket and subtly extracted the 500 euros from his passport. He palmed the money, sliding it into the sleeve of his peacoat. He reached the booth. He handed the passport to the guard. The young guard took the document. He didn't open it immediately. He looked at Brill, his cold eyes assessing the Canadian logistics auditor. "Purpose of visit?" the guard asked, his English clipped and accented. "Auditing a medical shipment bound for Minsk," Brill said. He kept his voice steady, his expression neutral. The guard opened the passport. He flipped through the pages. He ran his thumb over the entry stamps from Frankfurt and Warsaw. He frowned. "Your company? They do not use local auditors." "Our client requires independent verification," Brill said smoothly. The guard didn't look convinced. He placed the passport on a small scanner. He typed something into his keyboard. Brill waited. He felt the cold steel of the SIG against his spine. If the scanner flagged the passport as a fake, he would have less than 3 seconds to act before the armed guards standing behind the booth raised their weapons. He mapped the escape route. 2 guards to the right, 1 to the left. The steel gate behind them. It would be loud. It would be bloody. And it would guarantee a massive manhunt before he even reached Minsk. The scanner beeped. The guard stared at his screen. He frowned again. He typed something else. Brill shifted his weight slightly, preparing to move. The guard picked up the passport. He stamped it with a heavy, aggressive thud. He slid it back across the counter. "Enjoy your stay in Belarus," he said, his voice laced with a thinly veiled threat. Brill took the passport. "Thank you." He walked past the booth and through the heavy steel gates. He was in. He didn't relax. He walked with purpose, ignoring the cold sweat dampening his shirt. He found the taxi rank outside the station. He needed to get to Minsk. And he needed to get off the grid. He bypassed the official taxis lined up near the entrance and walked toward a battered, rusted Lada, idling in the shadows near the edge of the parking lot. The driver, an older man smoking a harsh-smelling cigarette, watched him approach. Brill opened the passenger door. "Minsk," he said, tossing a 50-euro note onto the dashboard. The driver looked at the money, then at Brill. He crushed his cigarette under his boot and put the car in gear. The journey to Minsk took 4 hours. The roads were dark and icy. The landscape was a desolate expanse of frozen fields and skeletal forests. The driver didn't speak. Brill didn't either. He used the time to review the intelligence on Sarah Vance. She was a logistics coordinator for a German agricultural firm, moving tractor parts. A boring, invisible cover. But she had been tracking something outside her primary parameters. A rogue arms pipeline. And her handler, Shelby's old contact, had received one encrypted burst transmission before she went dark. The pipeline is open. It was a vague message. It didn't tell Brill what she had found or who was involved. But it told him she had gotten too close to something dangerous. The Lada rattled into the outskirts of Minsk just after midnight. The city was a sprawling, brutalist monument to Soviet architecture. Massive concrete apartment blocks lined wide, empty avenues. The yellow glow of sodium streetlights cast harsh, long shadows. It was a city that felt like it was holding its breath. Brill had the driver drop him off a mile from Vance's last known address, an apartment building in a working-class district. He walked the rest of the way. The air was bitterly cold, the wind slicing through his peacoat. The streets were deserted. He moved with a silent, fluid grace, staying in the shadows, avoiding the pools of light cast by the street lamps. He found the building. It was a decaying, 5-story concrete block. The entrance was unlit, the heavy wooden door scarred and graffiti-covered. He didn't go in the front. He walked around to the back alley. The fire escape was a rusted iron skeleton clinging to the side of the building. He climbed. The metal was cold and slick with ice. He moved carefully, testing each step, minimizing the noise. He reached the 3rd floor. Vance's apartment was number 304. He found the window. It was dark. He took his lock-picking kit from his pocket. The lock on the window was cheap and old. He had it open in 10 seconds. He slid the window up and slipped inside. The apartment smelled of stale air, cheap cleaning fluid, and something else. Something metallic and sharp. He stood perfectly still in the darkness, letting his eyes adjust. He listened. The apartment was silent. He moved forward, a ghost in a foreign city. He found the living room. It was a disaster. The furniture was overturned, the upholstery slashed. Books and papers were scattered across the floor. The KDB had tossed the place. They had been thorough. He moved to the bedroom. It was in a similar state of ruin. The mattress was ripped open, the closet emptied. He wasn't looking for obvious clues. The KDB would have taken anything of value. He was looking for what they missed. He was looking for tradecraft. He searched the apartment with a meticulous, systematic efficiency. He checked the floorboards, the air vents, the space behind the electrical outlets. He found nothing. He returned to the kitchen. It was a small, cramped space. The refrigerator door hung open. The cupboards were empty. He examined the old, rusted radiator under the window. He ran his fingers along the metal piping, feeling for anomalies. He found it. A loose screw on the bracket holding the radiator to the wall. He used his pocket knife to unscrew it. He pulled the bracket away. Behind it, tucked into a small hollow carved into the plaster, was a micro SD card. A dead drop. He took the SD card. He had found the first piece of the puzzle. He turned toward the kitchen door. He heard it. The soft, almost imperceptible scrape of a boot on the hallway floor outside the apartment. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. 2 sets. The KDB sweep team had returned. Brill didn't freeze. He didn't panic. He moved. He couldn't go out the window he had entered. It was in the bedroom, down the hall from the front door. He was trapped in the kitchen. He assessed the environment. The small room. The overturned table. The rusted radiator. The old gas stove. He needed a distraction. A violent one. He moved to the gas stove. He turned all 4 burner knobs to the maximum setting. He didn't light them. He listened to the soft, deadly hiss of escaping gas filling the small, enclosed space. He heard a key slide into the lock on the front door. He didn't have a detonator. He didn't have a match. He looked at the single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling in the center of the kitchen. He moved to the wall switch near the door. He took his knife and quickly, brutally, slashed the plastic casing, exposing the wires. He severed the neutral wire, leaving the live wire exposed. The front door banged open. Brill ducked behind the overturned kitchen table, pressing himself flat against the floor. "Check the back rooms," a harsh voice commanded in Russian. Heavy boots pounded down the hallway toward the bedroom. The kitchen door swung open. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the room. The beam hit the exposed wire on the wall switch. "What the guard muttered, stepping into the kitchen. He smelled the gas. He reached for the light switch. "Don't touch it," the other guard yelled from the hallway. It was too late. The guard's finger brushed the exposed wire. A spark arced across the gap. The room exploded. The sound was a deafening, concussive roar that shattered the kitchen window and blew the door off its hinges. A wave of heat and fire rolled over Brill, shielded only by the heavy wooden table. He didn't wait for the smoke to clear. He didn't check to see if the guards were dead. He pushed the table aside and scrambled to his feet. The kitchen was an inferno. He dove through the shattered window, out into the freezing night air, and onto the fire escape. He didn't look back. He started climbing, moving up toward the roof, the flames from the apartment roaring below him. Chapter 3. The Kamaz transport truck ground its gears in a dying metallic shriek as Brill piloted it into the outer rings of Minsk. The Belarusian capital rose from the frozen plains like a monument to gray concrete and brutalist geometry. Row after row of identical, towering apartment blocks formed a labyrinth designed to crush individuality. Above, the sky was a bruised, starless black, reflecting the sickly amber glow of high-pressure sodium streetlights that painted the falling snow in hues of dirty sulfur. The truck's heater had died an hour past the border, leaving the cab feeling like the inside of a meat locker. Brill didn't shiver. He just drove, his eyes scanning the desolate ice-slicked avenues. He ditched the heavy rig in a sprawling, silent industrial park on the edge of the Frunzensky district. He left the keys in the ignition and the doors unlocked. In a city this starved, the truck would be stripped to its axles by dawn, destroying any forensic trace of his arrival. Brill moved on foot. He pulled the collar of his stolen, grease-stained jacket high against his neck, hunching his shoulders to mimic the defeated posture of the few locals shuffling through the pre-dawn freeze. He kept his hands in his pockets, his right hand resting on the textured polymer grip of the suppressed pistol Shelby had given him. The address from Shelby's dossier pointed to a Khrushchevka, a 5-story Soviet-era brick building practically crumbling under the weight of its own history. Brill approached it from a blind alley, avoiding the single, flickering streetlight near the main entrance. He checked the facades of the neighboring buildings. No cameras. Just dark, frost-rimmed windows staring back like dead eyes. He slipped through the rusted front door. The stairwell smelled of boiled cabbage, cheap tobacco, and ancient dampness. The air was stagnant, heavy with the trapped heat of failing radiators. Brill didn't take the stairs immediately. He stood perfectly still in the vestibule for 2 full minutes, his breathing shallow, letting the ambient acoustics of the building map themselves in his brain. The hum of a refrigerator on the second floor. A muffled cough from the first. The rhythmic clank of a steam pipe. No overlapping boot steps. No static hiss of a radio. He began his ascent, staying on the extreme outer edge of the concrete steps where the structural support was strongest, preventing the grit and ice beneath his boots from grinding audibly. 4th floor. Apartment 42. Brill paused on the landing. The corridor was illuminated by a single bare incandescent bulb hanging by a frayed wire. He didn't need to pick the lock. The heavy wooden door to Vance's safe house sat ajar, listing lazily on a single bent hinge. The doorframe was violently splintered. The deadbolt housing had been sheared clean out of the wood. Brill knelt, running a gloved finger over the point of impact. A kinetic breach. Not a battering ram, but a localized explosive charge, or a massive coordinated kick from a heavy tactical boot. He drew the suppressed pistol, thumbing off the safety. He sliced the pie, inching his field of vision around the doorframe to clear the fatal funnel of the entryway before stepping across the threshold. He swept the weapon left, then right. Hallway clear. Kitchen clear. Living area clear. The apartment was a graveyard of torn upholstery and shattered drywall. Brill lowered the weapon, shifting his gaze from the sights to the macro environment. The search team hadn't just tossed the place, they had subjected it to a focused, aggressive demolition. The cheap sofa was gutted, its yellow foam guts spilling across the linoleum. Every book on the small particle board shelf lay on the floor, their spines snapped, pages ripped out in clusters to check for hollowed compartments. The floorboards in the center of the room had been aggressively crowbarred up, exposing the dusty subflooring. Even the drywall behind the bed had been hammered open, exposing the building's skeletal wooden studs and rusted wiring. It was thorough, but it was angry. Brill holstered his pistol and began to walk the perimeter of the room. He analyzed the destruction like a forensic accountant, looking for a missing decimal point. KGB alpha groups were methodical, but they relied on volume and intimidation. They tore rooms apart, hoping the sheer scale of their destruction would unearth the prize. They looked for the obvious hiding spots: the taped envelope under the toilet tank, the false bottom in the dresser drawer, the hollowed-out outlet cover. All of those spots in Vance's apartment were utterly destroyed. But Sarah Vance was a NOC. Deep cover. She wouldn't use a textbook concealment. She would hide her insurance policy in a place where the aggressive, kinetic energy of a raid would actively obscure it. Brill dropped to a crouch, closing his eyes. He blocked out the smell of stale coffee and ozone, mapping the room in his head based on the structural bones of the building rather than the furniture. Water. Gas. Electricity. Heat. He opened his eyes and looked at the heavy cast-iron steam radiator beneath the single frost-covered window. The search team had pulled the radiator cover off and tossed it across the room. They had checked behind the metal fins, sweeping the dusty gap between the iron and the wall. Brill walked over to the radiator. The iron was blistering hot, hissing faintly as steam cycled through the antiquated pipes. He lay flat on his stomach, ignoring the debris digging into his ribs, and angled his head to look at the floorboards directly beneath the intake valve. The baseboard molding ran along the wall, fastened by old flathead screws layered under decades of cheap lead-based white paint. Brill traced the molding with his eyes, moving inch by inch. Dust. Scuff marks. A spider web, trembling in the convection draft. Then he saw it. The third screw from the left. The paint in the groove of the screw head wasn't chipped. It was perfectly surgically sliced. Someone had scored the paint with a razor blade, backed the screw out, and then carefully realigned the groove so the painted surface appeared unbroken to a casual observer. To a man swinging a sledgehammer into dry wall, it was completely invisible. Brill withdrew his combat knife from its sheath. He fitted the razor-sharp tip of the steel blade into the microscopic groove of the screw. He applied steady, even pressure, twisting his wrist. The screw turned silently. He backed it out and slipped it into his pocket. He wedged the blade behind the section of baseboard and pried gently. A 6-inch segment of the wood popped free, revealing a dark, dusty cavity between the floor joists. Brill reached his fingers into the hole. The heat radiating from the adjacent steam pipe was intense, threatening to blister his knuckles through his thin tactical gloves. He felt the rough concrete, the powdery dust of old plaster. His fingertips brushed something smooth. Synthetic. He hooked his index finger, dragging the object forward until he could pinch it. He pulled it out into the dim light of the ruined room. It was a small piece of black duct tape, folded over itself to create a waterproof, heat-resistant seal. Brill peeled the adhesive back with his thumb. Inside, nested like a dark jewel, was a micro SD card. The insurance policy. The reason they took her. The reason the room was destroyed. Brill slipped the SD card into a secure, waterproof zipper pocket on his chest rig. He picked up the piece of baseboard to slide it back into place. Before the wood met the wall, a vibration traveled through the floorboards. It was a subtle, low-frequency tremor that registered in Brill's kneecaps before it reached his ears. He froze, leaving the baseboard piece on the floor. He tilted his head toward the open doorway. The ambient noise of the building had vanished. The rattling pipe seemed to pause. The distant hum of the refrigerator stopped as its compressor cycled down. In the sudden vacuum of silence, a sound drifted up from the central stairwell. Thud. Pause. Thud. Pause. Heavy rubber soles striking concrete. Brill stood up silently, drawing the suppressed pistol in one fluid motion. He didn't move toward the door. He moved into the deep shadow of the kitchen archway, minimizing his profile. He tracked the acoustics. It wasn't one set of footsteps. The cadence was too rhythmic, too spread out. Thud, scrape. Thud. It was a stack. 4 men, maybe 5. Moving with tactical spacing. They weren't residents coming home from a late shift at a factory. They were moving deliberately, maintaining noise discipline, communicating through hand signals rather than voices. The sharp, metallic clack of a rifle sling swivel striking a metal handrail echoed up the shaft. They were armed. They were organized. And they were on the 3rd floor, moving up. The sweep team hadn't just tossed the room and left. They had established a perimeter. They had left a tripwire, or someone in a neighboring building had spotted Brill's entry. Brill calculated his exits. The window was a straight 4-story drop onto frozen concrete. The fire escape was rusted through, a death trap of brittle iron. The only way out was through the splintered door. The heavy, synchronized footfalls hit the 4th floor landing. Brill raised the pistol, leveling the tritium sights precisely at center mass of the fatal funnel, and waited in the dark. Chapter 4. Brill lowered the pistol. 5 heavily armored men, pushing through a fatal funnel, presented a chaotic tactical geometry. Even with a suppressed weapon and the element of surprise, the math favored the stack. A dying man could squeeze a trigger. A stray 5.45 millimeters round could shatter a femur. A firefight here meant noise, containment, and failure. He didn't need to kill them. He only needed them occupied. He backed silently out of the hallway arch and faded into the kitchen. The space was claustrophobic, reeking of grease and old food. Against the far wall sat a battered, Soviet-era gas range. Brill holstered his weapon. He stepped to the stove, grabbed all 4 plastic burner dials, and cranked them past the ignition click directly to the open flow position. He reached down and yanked the primary oven valve open as well. The sharp, sulfurous reek of methanethiol, the odorant added to natural gas, instantly choked the stagnant air. He had roughly 40 seconds before the gas-to-air ratio reached the lower explosive limit. He needed an ignition source, but one delayed just long enough to let him clear the blast radius. He looked up. A cheap, plastic light fixture hung from the ceiling, holding a single incandescent bulb. Brill climbed onto the cracked linoleum counter. He drew his combat knife, gripping it by the blade, and tapped the heavy steel pommel gently against the bulb. The glass cracked with a faint tink. He used the tip of the blade to pry the fragile glass envelope away, piece by piece, exposing the delicate coiled tungsten filament to the air. He hopped down, his boots making 0 sound on the linoleum. He moved to the gutted living room, grabbed a length of frayed speaker wire from a smashed radio, and moved back to the kitchen. He looped one end around the toggle of the kitchen light switch, pulling it downward to the off position. He ran the wire across the floor, tying the other end taut to the interior doorknob of the kitchen door. He pulled the door nearly shut, leaving a gap just wide enough for the gas to pool heavily behind it. The heavy, synchronized footfalls hit the hallway outside apartment 42. A low, guttural command in Russian bled through the drywall. Brill moved to the kitchen window. The latch was rusted shut. He drove the heel of his palm upward, shattering the rust bond, and shoved the window up. It squealed, a harsh scrape of metal on metal. Outside the apartment door, the movement stopped. The tactical team had heard the screech. The tempo of their assault shifted from a cautious sweep to an aggressive breach. Brill slid backward out the window, his boots blindly searching the exterior brick. He found a decorative limestone ledge, coated in an inch of smooth black ice. He gripped the frozen, crumbling mortar between the bricks, his fingers immediately numbing, and hauled his body out into the freezing wind. Crack! The splintered front door of the apartment gave way completely under the force of a battering ram. Heavy boots pounded into the living room. Brill didn't look down at the 4-story drop. He reached up, hooking his gloved fingers over the aluminum gutter of the roof parapet. He pulled his center of gravity upward, his muscles screaming against the sudden exertion in the sub-zero cold. Inside the apartment, a tactical light swept the kitchen door. A heavy boot kicked it inward. The door swung on its hinges. The taut speaker wire yanked the light switch toggle into the on position. 220 volts of unresisted electrical current slammed into the exposed tungsten filament. Stripped of its inert argon gas environment, the tungsten flashed white-hot and instantly vaporized, generating a massive blinding shower of sparks. The sparks met the concentrated pocket of methane. Brill threw his upper body over the snowy roof ledge just as the kitchen detonated. The explosion didn't sound like a bomb. It was a deep, concussive whoomph of rapidly displaced air. The shockwave blew the kitchen window out of its frame in a jagged cloud of glass and splintered wood, vomiting a rolling fireball of blue and orange plasma into the alley. The heat wave washed over the back of Brill's neck, singeing the collar of his jacket as he rolled over the parapet and dropped into a knee-deep snowdrift on the flat tar paper roof. Below him, the chaotic shouts of the Alpha team turned into raw, panicked screaming. Brill didn't pause to admire his work. He scrambled to his feet, sprinting across the icy roof. He leapt the 4-foot gap over the alleyway, landing heavily on the adjacent building. He moved like a ghost through the snow, navigating a maze of ventilation shafts and rusted satellite dishes, leaving the burning Khrushchevka behind. 3 blocks east, he dropped down a fire escape into a lightless alley. A boxy, rust-eaten Lada Niva sat parked near an overflowing dumpster, heavily layered in frost. Brill punched a hardened steel center punch into the driver's side lock cylinder, shattering the tumblers, and pulled the door open. He ducked under the steering column, ripped away the cheap plastic cowling, and sliced the ignition wires with his combat knife. He touched the red and yellow copper ends together. The engine coughed, sputtered, and settled into a rough, rattling idle. He threw the car into gear and pulled out onto the desolate street, keeping his headlights off until he merged onto a wider, better-lit avenue. He drove with clinical precision, melting into the sparse early morning traffic. With his left hand on the wheel, he used his right to unzip his jacket and extract a ruggedized encrypted field tablet. He wedged it between the passenger seat and the center console. He retrieved the micro SD card from his chest rig and slotted it into the tablet's encrypted reader. He typed in a 12-digit alphanumeric bypass code provided by Shelby. The screen blinked black, then flooded with lines of decrypting code. Folders populated the screen. Brill tapped the screen. He didn't find burn notices. He didn't find compromised operational logs indicating Vance had slipped up. He found shipping manifests. He scrolled through the data, his eyes scanning the Cyrillic and English text. Cargo logs from the port of Odessa. Flight plans originating from decommissioned Soviet airstrips. Bank transfers routing through Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. The cargo wasn't black market caviar or smuggled timber. It was hardware. Pallets of M4 carbines. Crates of night vision optics. Dozens of FGM-148 Javelin anti-tank missiles. It was top-tier, serialized NATO equipment, somehow bleeding out of the supply chain and moving through Belarus. Vance hadn't been swept up in a random police raid. She had stumbled onto a massive, high-level arms pipeline, and she had built a comprehensive ledger of the operation. She was a threat. Brill opened the final directory, labeled Facilitator_Primary. A high-resolution photograph loaded onto the screen. It showed a man in his late 50s, his face heavily scarred, his eyes carrying the flat, dead affect of a seasoned predator. He wore the crisp, olive-drab dress uniform of the Belarusian state security apparatus, a chest full of medals gleaming under harsh lighting. Brill read the dossier attached to the photograph. The operation wasn't being run by a street-level cartel or a rogue military quartermaster. The buyer, the seller, and the absolute architect of the pipeline was staring back at him from the screen. Director Volkov, head of the Belarusian KGB. Chapter 5. The stolen Lada Niva died a mile from the rail yard. The engine seized with a terminal, metallic clatter, bleeding hot oil onto the frozen asphalt. Brill didn't try to restart it. He wiped the steering wheel and door handle with a rag, erasing his prints. He stepped out into the punishing cold. The wind off the Svislach River sliced through his jacket like a razor. Minsk at 3 a.m. was a dead zone. The brutalist concrete apartment blocks loomed in the dark, silent and watchful. He walked. He kept to the shadows, avoiding the sickly yellow pools of the sodium street lamps. His mind was compartmentalized. The explosion at the apartment was behind him. The decrypted files, exposing Director Volkov's arms pipeline, were secure on the tablet in his pack. The objective was ahead. Procurement. He reached the perimeter of the Minsk Sortyrevokny rail yard. It was a sprawling industrial wasteland of rusted iron and rotting wood. Hundreds of decommissioned Soviet-era boxcars sat on weed-choked tracks, waiting to turn to dust. The air tasted of creosote, diesel, and frozen mud. Shelby's dossier had provided a name. Taras. A former Belarusian Spetsnaz quartermaster who realized there was more money in selling stolen hardware than guarding it. He operated out of the deepest, deadest section of the yard. Brill didn't use the main access road. He went over a chain-link fence, topped with rusted razor wire, moving with silent economical precision. He dropped onto the frozen gravel on the other side. He navigated the maze of train cars. He moved like a shadow cast by the moon. He placed his feet on the wooden ties, avoiding the loose gravel that would crunch under his weight. He listened. The wind whistled through the hollow steel of the empty cars, a low, mournful howl. He smelled them before he saw them. Cheap tobacco and burning kerosene. Brill stopped behind the rusted wheels of a tanker car. 50 yards ahead, a heavy maintenance shed sat isolated at the end of a spur line. The windows were blacked out with paint. A faint sliver of orange light leaked from under the heavy steel sliding door. 2 men stood outside in the freezing wind. Guards. They were wearing bulky surplus parkas, stamping their feet to stay warm. One held an AK-74 across his chest. The other was smoking, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. They were miserable. Miserable men were distracted men. Brill didn't engage them. Gunfire outside the shed would alert the boss inside. He needed the boss alive. For now. He studied the structure of the shed. A corrugated tin roof. A rusted ventilation hatch near the rear peak. Brill backed away, circling the perimeter in a wide, silent arc. He approached the shed from the blind side, opposite the guards. The corrugated metal was slick with frost. He found a stack of discarded wooden pallets and used them as a ladder. He pulled himself onto the roof. The tin groaned softly under his weight. He froze, waiting for a reaction from below. Nothing. The wind masked the sound. He crawled to the ventilation hatch. It was secured by a rusted padlock. Brill took a small vial of highly concentrated acid from his kit. He applied 3 drops to the internal mechanism of the lock. He waited 60 seconds. He struck the lock with the heavy steel pommel of his combat knife. The corroded internal pins shattered. The lock fell open into his hand. He lifted the hatch. Warm, foul-smelling air rushed up to meet him. He peered into the shed. The space was cavernous. Crates of ammunition, stacked tires, and scavenged engine parts formed a chaotic labyrinth. In the center of the room, a kerosene heater glowed bright orange. Behind a heavy steel workbench sat Taras. He was a massive man, thick with muscle and fat. He was eating a bowl of canned stew, a Makarov pistol resting on the table next to his spoon. There was a third guard inside. He stood near the heater, warming his hands. He wore a tactical vest over a black sweater. A PP-19 Vityaz submachine gun hung from a single-point sling on his chest. He was the primary threat. Brill calculated the drop. 15 feet. Directly behind the internal guard. He slid through the hatch, lowering himself by his arms until he was hanging by his fingertips. He let go. He landed in a crouch. The rubber soles of his tactical boots absorbed the impact. He made no sound. The guard by the heater didn't turn. He just kept rubbing his hands together. Brill closed the distance in 2 strides. He didn't use a weapon. Weapons were tools. The body was the machine. He stepped inside the guard's peripheral vision. His left hand clamped over the man's mouth, jerking his head back and exposing the throat. Simultaneously, Brill's right forearm drove forward, striking the side of the guard's neck with the force of a swinging bat. The vagus nerve strike was flawless. It severed the brain's connection to the body in a fraction of a second. The guard's eyes rolled back. His knees buckled. Brill caught the dead weight before it hit the floor. He lowered the unconscious man silently to the concrete, shifting the submachine gun so it wouldn't clatter. 10 seconds. 1 down. Taras was still eating his stew, staring at a ledger on his desk. He hadn't heard a thing. Brill stepped out of the shadows and walked into the circle of light cast by the kerosene heater. Taras looked up. The spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes went wide, trying to process the sudden appearance of a tall, cold-eyed Westerner in the center of his secure facility. Taras dropped the spoon and lunged for the Makarov on the table. He was too slow. Brill didn't draw his gun. He kicked the heavy steel workbench. The thick metal edge slammed into Taras's sternum, pinning him against his chair. Taras gasped, the wind knocked out of him. His hand fell inches short of the pistol. Brill stepped forward, snatched the Makarov off the table, and ejected the magazine. He racked the slide, catching the live round in the air, and tossed the empty weapon into the darkness. He leaned over the table. He grabbed Taras by the throat of his heavy coat. "I need hardware," Brill said. His voice was a flat, emotionless drone. Taras choked, his hands coming up to claw at Brill's grip. "My men, outside," he wheezed in accented English. "Are freezing," Brill said. "By the time they realize you aren't answering your radio, we will be finished here." Brill increased the pressure on the man's throat, just enough to stop the blood flow to his brain. Taras's face began to turn a mottled purple. Panic replaced the anger in his eyes. "Hardware," Brill repeated. He loosened his grip. Taras sucked in a ragged breath. He nodded frantically. What do you want?" "AKS-74U," Brill commanded. "Clean. Reliable. 3 loaded magazines. Subsonic ammunition." Taras pointed a trembling finger toward a stack of olive-drab crates against the far wall. Third crate from the top. Pried open. Brill didn't let go of the man's coat. He dragged Taras around the table, keeping him between himself and the front door. They walked to the crates. Brill opened the crate with one hand. Inside, packed in heavy grease, lay the compact assault rifles. He pulled one out. The Krinkov. Short barrel, folding stock. A brutal weapon designed for vehicle crews and close-quarters combat. He checked the action. He racked the bolt. The metal slid smoothly. He smelled the chamber. Gun oil and clean steel. No pitting. He checked the magazines. They were loaded with heavy, 150-grain subsonic rounds. Perfect for suppressed work. He slung the weapon over his shoulder. Explosives, Brill said. Taras swallowed hard. I am a quartermaster, not a demolition expert. Brill pushed him against the stack of crates. He drew his combat knife. The steel gleamed in the dim light. Do not lie to me, Taras. You supply Volkov's off-the-books operations. You have plastic. Taras stared at the blade. He broke. Locker. By the desk. Bottom shelf. Brill walked him back to the desk. He kicked the locker open. On the bottom shelf sat 4 blocks of Semtex H wrapped in brown wax paper. Next to them was a box of electronic blasting caps and 2 remote detonators. Brill took 2 blocks of the explosive and the detonators. He shoved them into his waterproof pack. Clothing, Brill demanded. What? A uniform. Oman. KGB Alpha. Or Okrestina Guard. Dark green or black. Size large. Taras pointed to a row of metal lockers near the back of the shed. Brill marched him over. Inside hung several sets of tactical uniforms. Brill pulled down a heavy, black tactical uniform with no identifying unit patches. The generic armor of a state security enforcer. It would fit. He stuffed it into his pack. The shopping was done. The intelligence gathering remained. Brill slammed Taras back against the lockers. He pressed his forearm against the man's throat, pinning his head to the metal door. Sarah Vance, Brill said. Taras's eyes darted away. I don't know that name. American. Female. Mid-20s. Taken 3 days ago by KGB elements. You supply the transport vehicles. You supply the black sites. Where did Volkov take her? I just sell guns. Taras gasped, struggling against the pressure. I don't ask about the cargo. Brill drew the suppressed Sig Sauer from the small of his back. He pressed the hot muzzle directly against the soft tissue under Taras's jaw. Volkov is running an arms pipeline, Brill whispered. Vance found it. She became a liability. He didn't take her to the yellow building on Independence Avenue. That is for politicians and journalists. He took her somewhere dark. Somewhere off the grid. Taras was sweating profusely despite the cold shed. He felt the cold steel of the suppressor digging into his skin. He looked into Brill's eyes and saw absolute, unwavering certainty. The ghost would pull the trigger and not lose a second of sleep. If I tell you, Volkov will skin me alive, Taras choked out. If you don't tell me, Brill said, you will not live long enough to worry about Volkov. He clicked the safety off the Sig. The sound was deafening in the quiet shed. Taras squeezed his eyes shut. She is not in a black site, he whispered rapidly, the words spilling out in a panicked rush. Volkov wanted her isolated. Completely controlled. He took her to the fortress. Brill tightened his grip. Name it. Taras opened his eyes. They were wide with a terror that superseded his fear of the gun. He was speaking a cursed word. Okrestina, Taras breathed. Brill held the man's gaze for 2 seconds. Okrestina. The detention center on the south side of Minsk. It wasn't a police station. It was a factory of pain. Windowless cells, soundproofed basements, and guards who were selected specifically for their lack of empathy. It was an impenetrable concrete block where political dissidents went in and never came out. It was the worst-case scenario. Brill didn't blink. He pulled the cig away from Teres's jaw. In one fluid motion, he brought the heavy base of the pistol down onto the side of Teres's skull. The quartermaster dropped to the concrete like a sack of wet cement. Brill didn't look back. He grabbed his pack, the stolen uniform, and the heavy AKS-74U. He moved back to the ventilation hatch. He pulled himself up and out into the freezing, howling wind of the Belarusian night. He slid down the icy roof and dropped back into the shadows of the train yard. The guards at the front of the shed were still stamping their feet, smoking, oblivious to the fact that their boss was bleeding on the floor inside. Brill checked the action on the Krinkov. The cold steel felt heavy and right in his hands. He had his hardware. He had his disguise. He had his target. Okrestina. A fortress built to keep the world out. Brill melted into the labyrinth of rusted trains, heading south. He was going to break in. Chapter 6. The stench of Okrestina wasn't just physical. It was psychological. It was the smell of fierce sweat baked into cold concrete, overlaid with the sharp clinical sting of industrial bleach trying and failing to mask the scent of old blood. Brill clung to the undercarriage of the heavy Kamaz laundry truck, the road grime and freezing slush spraying against his stolen uniform. His muscles burned with a dull, lactic fire from holding his body rigid against the vibration of the axles. The truck slowed, the diesel engine rumbling down into a rough idle. Air brakes hissed, a sharp exhalation of pressure. They had reached the outer perimeter checkpoint. Brill didn't move his head, but his eyes tracked the shift in light beneath the chassis. The amber glow of the street lamps was replaced by the harsh, white glare of high-intensity halogen security floods. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel. 2 sets. A voice barked a command in Russian. The driver responded, his tone bored, handing down a manifest clipboard. Clack. Clack. The sound of a heavy inspection mirror, mounted on a long pole with caster wheels hitting the pavement. Brill pressed his spine flat against the driveshaft housing, minimizing his profile. The mirror rolled under the front bumper. The beam of a tactical flashlight swept across the engine block, cutting through the shadows. The mirror rolled back, checking the exhaust manifold, then moved toward the rear axles. The beam washed over Brill's boot. It lingered for half a second. He didn't flinch. He didn't breathe. The generic black tactical uniform blended with the grease and shadow of the undercarriage, but the geometry of a human body was undeniable. The mirror rolled away. The guard grunted something unintelligible to the driver. The clipboard was slapped back against the steering wheel. The heavy steel gates groaned open. The truck lurched forward. Brill exhaled a slow, controlled breath through his nose. He had factored in the mirror. He had factored in the laziness of a guard at 4 a.m., checking a laundry truck he saw every Tuesday. The margin of error was razor thin, but he was inside the wire. The truck crawled across the inner courtyard and backed up to a loading dock with a jolting thud. The engine died. The driver's door slammed. Brill waited 10 seconds. He dropped from the undercarriage, landing silently in a crouch on the oil-stained concrete. The loading bay was illuminated by a single, caged bulb. The driver, a hunched man in a heavy coat, was already walking toward a small security booth near the inner doors, digging a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his pocket. The back of the Kamaz was secured by a heavy rolling door. Brill moved to it. He drew the suppressed Sig Sauer and kept it tight against his hip. He didn't pick the lock. The driver had left it unsecured, expecting the laundry crew to handle the unloading. Brill hauled the door up just enough to slide underneath. The interior of the truck reeked of damp wool, sweat, and bleach. 4 massive, canvas-sided laundry carts sat strapped to the walls. He climbed into the nearest cart, burying himself beneath a mound of coarse gray prison blankets. He arranged the fabric to leave a small breathing hole and a narrow slit for observation. He waited. 5 minutes later, the inner doors of the loading dock clanged open. 3 men in gray coveralls, trustees by the look of their defeated posture, shuffled out, escorted by a single guard holding a baton. They lowered the truck ramp and began manhandling the heavy carts down onto the dock. The jolt sent pain spiking through Brill's cramped shoulders, but he remained perfectly still. The cart was rolled inside. The transition from the freezing loading dock to the interior of Okrestina was immediate. The air grew stagnant and oppressively warm. The sound of the rolling wheels echoed off bare concrete walls. They were in the subterranean service level. Brill listened to the acoustics. The echo was short, sharp. Low ceilings. Narrow corridors. The cart stopped. A heavy door slammed shut behind them. The trustees began pulling blankets from the cart adjacent to Brill's, feeding them into the massive industrial washing machines that roared to life with a deafening, metallic churning. The guard stood near the door, tapping his baton against his leg, watching the trustees with bored indifference. The chaotic noise of the machines was perfect cover. Brill shifted the blankets. He rose from the cart like a shadow, detaching from the gray fabric. The guard didn't see him until it was too late. Brill didn't use the gun. He stepped behind the guard, his left arm snaking around the man's throat, cutting off his airway instantly. His right hand clamped over the guard's mouth, stifling any cry. He drove his knee into the back of the guard's knee, buckling his leg and dropping him silently to the concrete floor. He held the chokehold for 8 seconds. The guard's eyes rolled back. He went limp. The 3 trustees had stopped working. They stared at Brill, their eyes wide with terror, the wet blankets forgotten in their hands. They didn't scream. They were conditioned to fear the guards, but they feared the sudden, violent ghost in their midst more. Brill didn't speak to them. He didn't have time. He dragged the unconscious guard behind a row of heavy chemical drums. He stripped the man of his heavy key ring, a tactical radio, and a stun baton. He looked at the trustees. He raised a single finger to his lips. They nodded frantically, terrified into compliance, and immediately went back to loading the machines, their movements jerky and panicked. Brill moved to the heavy steel door leading out of the laundry room. He checked the keys against the lock. The third one fit. He turned it silently. He slipped out into the corridor. It was a long, featureless tunnel of gray concrete, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes. There were no cell doors here. This was the nervous system of the facility: pipes, electrical conduits, and maintenance access. He needed the subbasement. He needed the interrogation block. He moved with absolute silence, hugging the walls. He navigated 2 intersections, using the stolen radio to monitor the guard chatter. The earpiece crackled with routine check-ins. Nothing to indicate a breach. He reached a heavy steel stairwell door. He opened it a crack. The stairs descended into a darkness that felt heavier, older. The smell of bleach was weaker here, overpowered by the sharp, coppery scent of old blood. He went down. The subbasement was a labyrinth of soundproof doors and observation rooms. This wasn't where they held prisoners. This was where they broke them. Brill heard it before he saw it. A sharp, sudden cry, immediately muffled. The sound of a heavy impact against flesh. He moved toward the sound. It was coming from a room at the end of the hall. The door was heavy steel, with a small, thick glass observation window. Brill crept to the window and looked inside. The room was bare concrete, illuminated by a harsh, swinging halogen bulb. A rusted iron chair sat bolted to the floor in the center. Sarah Vance was strapped to the chair. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat and blood. Her face was bruised, her lips split. She was breathing heavily, her head slumped forward. She looked broken. But her eyes, when she lifted her head, were not broken. They were a flat, unreadable gray, burning with a cold, focused hatred. Standing over her was Director Volkov. He was in his shirt sleeves, his tie loosened. He held a heavy, rubber-coated baton. Two massive, armored guards stood in the corners of the room, their faces hidden behind dark visors. Volkov spoke in Russian, his voice a low, cultured purr that was more terrifying than a shout. He raised the baton. Brill didn't hesitate. The window of opportunity was closed. It was time to shatter the glass. He raised the suppressed Sig Sauer, resting the muzzle directly against the thick observation window, and pulled the trigger. Chapter 7. The 9mm subsonic round did not shatter the heavy observation pane. It punched a neat, smoking hole through the first two layers of laminated acrylic, webbing the surface in a fractal starburst of weakened glass. Brill stepped back a half pace. He drove the flat heel of his tactical boot directly into the center of the fracture. The window blew inward, in a jagged avalanche of frosted cubes and heavy shards. The acoustic seal broke. The sharp crack of the baton and Sarah Vance's ragged breathing were instantly swallowed by the clatter of raining glass. Brill vaulted through the empty frame, hitting the concrete floor, rolling to shed his momentum. He came up in a crouch, the suppressed Sig Sauer tracking for targets. Guard 1 held the left corner. He fumbled with the sling of a PP-19 Vityaz submachine gun, his gloved fingers slipping on the nylon. Brill fired twice. Center mass was protected by heavy ceramic trauma plates, so he aimed higher. 2 rounds punched through the soft, exposed Kevlar weave beneath the guard's jawline. The man dropped straight down, collapsing like a severed marionette. Guard 2 was smarter. He occupied the right corner and abandoned his slung rifle, drawing a heavy combat knife and charging. Brill rose and stepped inside the wide, sweeping arc of the blade. He caught the guard's wrist, applying a savage, twisting torque until the radius bone popped. As the armored man's momentum carried him forward, Brill drove the heavy steel suppressor of his pistol directly into the guard's sternum. He followed with a crushing elbow strike to the temple, cracking the tactical helmet against the concrete wall. The guard slid to the floor, leaving a dark smear on the gray paint. 4 seconds. 2 down. Volkov had frozen in the center of the room. The director processed the sudden, violent intrusion with the sluggish shock of a man used to inflicting pain, not receiving it. He dropped the rubber baton. His hand darted under his tailored shirt toward a shoulder holster. Brill closed the distance, holstering the SIG in one fluid motion. He needed the architect of the pipeline alive. He trapped Volkov's reaching arm, pinning the director's wrist against his own chest, and drove a palm strike directly into Volkov's elbow joint. The cartilage tore with a sickening crunch. Volkov shrieked, a high, reedy sound entirely devoid of its former cultured purr. Brill scooped up the dropped rubber baton. He swung it in a short, brutal arc, connecting solidly with the side of Volkov's right knee. The joint shattered. Volkov collapsed onto the bloody concrete, writhing, his crisp shirt sleeves soaking up the filth of his own interrogation room. Brill kicked the director's dropped pistol across the floor, then turned to the rusted iron chair. Sarah Vance was breathing fast, her chest heaving against the heavy leather straps. The sudden explosion of violence had triggered a massive adrenaline dump. Her gray eyes were wide, tracking his every twitch. Brill drew his combat knife and stepped behind the chair, grabbing the heavy buckle of her chest strap. "Hold still," he murmured, his voice barely carrying over Volkov's moans. He sliced the thick leather. The moment the tension released, Vance exploded. It was pure, unadulterated survival instinct. She saw only another man, in a dark uniform, holding a blade. She spun in the chair, driving her elbow backward in a vicious arc aimed at his throat. Brill ducked the strike, letting the momentum carry her out of the chair. She lunged, clawing for the knife, her fingernails raking across his forearm. He absorbed her forward energy, stepping to the side and hooked his leg behind her knee. She went down hard. Brill followed, pinning her to the cold floor. He trapped her wrists against the concrete, applying just enough body weight to neutralize her thrashing limbs without snapping them. She fought like a cornered animal, her teeth bared, a guttural snarl tearing from her raw throat. She smelled of copper, stale sweat, and sheer terror. "Listen to me," Brill whispered, putting his mouth an inch from her ear. She thrashed harder, trying to buck him off. "Shelby Johnson," Brill said, his voice flat and calm. "Beirut, 1998. The words hit her like a physical blow. The thrashing stopped immediately. Her breathing hitched, remaining ragged, but the feral panic in her eyes slowly receded. It was replaced by a stunned, calculating clarity. "Who are you?" she rasped. Her voice was shredded. "The extraction," Brill said. He released her wrists and stood up, offering a hand. She ignored it, pushing herself off the bloody floor with a sharp wince. She swayed slightly, assessing her battered body, then looked down at Volkov, who was still whimpering in the corner. "You should have killed him," Vance whispered. "He's leverage," Brill said. He moved to the dead guard near the door and began stripping the man's tactical vest, checking the pouches for spare magazines. A high-pitched electronic chirp broke the heavy silence of the room. Brill froze. His eyes snapped to the first guard he had killed, the one with the bullet holes beneath the jaw. A small, black rectangular device attached to the guard's tactical belt was pulsing with a rapid, angry red light. The chirp accelerated into a continuous, piercing whine. Biometric telemetry. A dead man's switch tied directly to the guard's heart rate monitor. "Move," Brill ordered, tossing Vance a scavenged Makarov pistol. He grabbed the heavy steel handle of the interrogation room door and yanked it open. The corridor outside was no longer silent. The piercing whine of the belt device was suddenly swallowed by a massive, bone-rattling klaxon echoing through the subterranean tunnels. Emergency strobe lights engaged, washing the gray concrete in a pulsating, bloody glare. Chapter 8. The hydraulic hiss of the loading bay airlock faded, replaced by the heavy, echoing slam of solid steel doors meeting concrete. Inside the cavernous intake garage of Okrestina, Brill remained motionless beneath a mound of soiled canvas. The air trapped inside the industrial laundry cart was thick and noxious. It smelled of cheap institutional detergent, masking the unmistakable metallic tang of dried blood and the ammonia bite of human terror. He listened. The diesel engine of the transport truck ticked down, radiating heat. The driver killed the engine, popped the cab door, and dropped to the floor with a heavy grunt. Footsteps echoed away, joined by the muffled banter of two dock guards in rapid guttural Russian. A heavy metal latch threw, and a door slammed. The bay fell silent. Brill shifted his weight, pushing upward. The heavy lid of the cart groaned on its hinges. He slipped over the rim, landing in a deep crouch on the oil-stained concrete. The garage was lit by high-pressure sodium bulbs caged in wire mesh, casting long, sharp shadows across the fleet of idling transport vans. He moved instantly, hugging the blind side of the truck. He reached the intake doors and bypassed the main electronic lock, slipping instead through a rusted reinforced fire exit that opened into the facility's capillary network of service corridors. The atmosphere shifted the moment the door clicked shut behind him. The air in the guts of Okrestina was stagnant and frigid. It tasted of bleach and old copper, settling heavy on the back of the tongue. Overhead, exposed steam pipes hissed, dripping condensation onto the slick, polished floorboards. Brill navigated the subterranean labyrinth with predatory fluidity. He rolled his footsteps from heel to toe, absorbing the kinetic impact in his knees, rendering his movement completely silent against the ambient hum of the building. His right hand remained indexed on the grip of his suppressed pistol. His left hung loose, ready to strike or grapple. He was hunting the sub-basement. 50 yards down the corridor, the rhythmic, lazy squeak of rubber against linoleum echoed around a blind corner. Brill flattened his spine against a shallow recess housing a fire extinguisher. He controlled his breathing, lowering his heart rate to a crawl. The squeak grew louder. A guard rounded the corner. He was young, heavily built, wearing the dark blue fatigues of the Oman riot police. A Kalashnikov hung slack on a tactical sling across his chest. He was staring at a cracked smartphone in his palm, his thumb swiping upward in the dim light, wholly disconnected from his environment. Brill let him pass. He waited for the man to take exactly 2 steps beyond the recess. In one explosive motion, Brill stepped off the wall. He clamped his left hand over the guard's mouth and nose, his reinforced tactical gloves sealing off any chance of a shout. Simultaneously, his right arm snaked around the man's thick neck, the crook of his elbow locking perfectly under the jawline. Brill dropped his center of gravity, driving his knee into the back of the guard's thigh. The leg buckled. Brill dragged the heavy man backward into the dark recess of the alcove, tightening the blood choke. The guard panicked. He dropped his phone, the screen shattering on the floor. His hands flew up, clawing desperately at Brill's forearm, but the leverage was absolute. Brill clamped down on the carotid arteries, shutting off the oxygen supply to the brain. 7 seconds of frantic, thrashing resistance. Then, a sudden, heavy slackness. Brill lowered the unconscious mass silently to the floor. He didn't waste time checking a pulse. He drew his combat knife and drove the heavy steel pommel into the base of the guard's skull, ensuring he would stay under. With clinical efficiency, Brill stripped the guard's tactical belt. He secured a heavy ring of brass skeleton keys and a magnetized security swipe card. He dragged the body fully behind a stack of broken wooden pallets and resumed his advance. The swipe card granted him access through a reinforced security gate at the end of the hall. He entered a tight, spiraling concrete stairwell. He descended. Sub-level 1. Sub-level 2. The temperature plummeted. The walls here were unpainted, weeping moisture that froze into thin sheets of black ice near the floorboards. The industrial hum of the upper floors vanished, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating silence. This architecture wasn't designed for incarceration. It was designed for psychological annihilation. He pushed through a heavy fire door into the interrogation block. The corridor was narrow, lined with thick steel doors devoid of handles, each marked with a single stenciled number in chipped red paint. A sudden, raw sound shattered the quiet. It was a scream, sharp, defiant, and abruptly choked off by a wet, heavy thud. It tore through the heavy concrete, echoing down the bleak hallway. Brill didn't flinch. His pace quickened, his boots gliding over the frosted concrete as he tracked the acoustic signature. The sound had originated from the end of the block. Cell 4. He approached the door. It was solid plate steel, secured by an electronic deadbolt and featuring a single narrow viewing slit made of thick, scratched ballistic glass. Brill pressed his eye to the glass, blocking the ambient light with his cupped hand to see inside. Harsh, blinding halogen light flooded the windowless box. In the center of the room, Sarah Vance hung suspended by heavy chains attached to a ceiling winch. Her boots barely grazed the rusted drain in the concrete floor. Her face was a swollen landscape of deep purple contusions, a thin line of dark blood trailing from her split lip to her collarbone. Her chest heaved with ragged, shallow breaths. Standing directly in front of her was Director Volkov. The head of the Belarusian KGB had removed his pristine suit jacket. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, exposing thick, scarred forearms. As Brill watched through the glass, Volkov adjusted his grip on a dense steel-cored rubber truncheon. He planted his boots on the wet concrete, drew his arm back, and raised the heavy baton high over his shoulder. Chapter 9. The klaxon was a physical assault. It didn't just ring, it battered the eardrums and vibrated in the teeth. Red strobe lights bolted to the concrete ceiling, sliced the interrogation room into harsh, disjointed freeze frames. Brill calculated the response time. Okrestina was a fortress. The inner guard would lock down the sub-basement stairwells in 45 seconds. They had used 10. He looked at Vance. She wasn't panicking. She stood in the bloody strobe light, racking the slide of the scavenged Makarov to check the chamber. Her eyes were flat and focused. She was a NOC. She understood the math. Volkov writhed on the floor, clutching his shattered knee, his breath hissing through clenched teeth. "Get up," Brill ordered the director. "I cannot walk," Volkov spat, his face slick with sweat. A crippled hostage was a dead weight. Brill didn't debate the morality of the moment. He stepped over the director, aiming the suppressed SIG at the open doorway. "We leave him," Brill said over the blare of the alarm. "Stay on my 6. Watch the rear." Vance nodded. She stepped out of the room behind him. The corridor was a tunnel of pulsing red light. At the far end, the heavy steel door to the maintenance sector banged open. 3 guards spilled through, their boots pounding the linoleum. They carried compact, short-barreled AK-74Us. Brill fired twice. The first guard dropped instantly, a hollow point expanding in his throat. The second guard raised his weapon. A sharp, deafening crack echoed over Brill's shoulder. Vance had fired the Makarov. The 9mm round caught the second guard in the bridge of the nose. He crumpled. The third guard scrambled backward, diving for cover behind a concrete pillar. "Move," Brill said. They sprinted down the hall. Brill drew a block of Semtex from his pack on the run. He peeled the wax paper back. As they passed a narrow T-junction, he slapped the plastic explosive directly onto the load-bearing concrete wall. He jammed an electronic detonator cap into the putty, trailing a thin, near-invisible length of monofilament tripwire across the intersecting hallway. He anchored it to a rusted heating pipe. 5 seconds. They reached the heavy fire doors, separating the interrogation block from the main stairwell. Brill pushed through. Vance followed. Behind them, heavy boots pounded down the intersecting hallway. The pursuit team hit the tripwire. The Semtex detonated. The shockwave hit them like a physical wall, throwing Brill and Vance forward onto the cold concrete of the stairwell landing. The concussion deafened the klaxons for a long, ringing second. A cloud of pulverized concrete and gray dust blew through the heavy fire doors, choking the stagnant air. The rear flank was sealed under tons of collapsed rubble. Brill pushed himself up. He tasted plaster dust and ozone. "You hit?" he asked. Vance wiped a streak of blood from a cut on her forehead. She dropped the empty Makarov and scooped up a PP-19 submachine gun from the guard Brill had choked out earlier. She checked the magazine, slapped it home, and racked the bolt. "I'm good," she rasped. They stood on the lowest landing of the main stairwell. The concrete steps spiraled upward into the belly of the facility. The strobe lights flashed off the gray walls, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Brill started up the steps, his weapon raised, tracking the angles. He made it to the first switchback landing. He stopped. The air above them was thick with a new sound. It wasn't the chaotic shouting of prison guards. It was the synchronized, heavy clank of tactical boots on concrete. The sound of a disciplined, heavily armored military unit. Brill looked up through the center gap of the stairwell. 3 floors up, the stairs were choked with men. They wore heavy black ballistic armor. They carried interlocking, full-body ceramic riot shields, forming an impenetrable, descending wall of steel. Behind the shields, the red laser sights of 24 assault rifles cut through the settling dust, painting the walls and the floor around Brill in a grid of lethal geometry. Oman. The state riot police. The exit was blocked. Chapter 10. The klaxon shrieked, a high-frequency mechanical wail that vibrated in the fillings of Brill's teeth. Harsh amber strobe lights embedded in the ceiling cages snapped to life, painting the gray concrete of the interrogation room in violent, flashing intervals. The facility was awake. The dead man's switch had sealed their timeline. Brill didn't waste a second looking at Volkov, who was writhing on the blood-slicked floor, clutching his shattered arm. Instead, Brill kicked the Kalashnikov of the closest dead guard across the concrete. The rifle slid to a halt inches from Sarah Vance's boots. She was bleeding from a deep laceration above her left eye, her breathing ragged, leaning heavily against the steel interrogation table. She looked down at the weapon. Then she looked at Brill. "Can you run?" Brill asked, his voice flat, cutting through the wail of the alarms. Vance didn't answer. She bent down, grabbed the AK-74U by the pistol grip, and racked the bolt back with her bloody palm. A live 5.45mm round, ejected, spinning through the air and clinking against the floor, ensuring a fresh cartridge seated directly into the chamber. She slapped the fire selector up to semi-auto and anchored the steel folding stock tightly against her bruised shoulder. "I can shoot," she rasped. Brill gave a single, curt nod. He stepped out of the interrogation room and into the freezing corridor. The sub-basement was a concrete artery designed to disorient and isolate. Now it was a kill zone. Heavy booted footsteps thundered from the eastern stairwell, the sound amplifying and bouncing off the hard, weeping walls. Brill moved with aggressive fluidity, his suppressed pistol leading his line of sight. Vance fell in a half-step behind his right shoulder, perfectly covering his rear flank. She moved with a pronounced limp, favoring her right leg, but her muzzle discipline was flawless. 3 guards in heavy blue Oman fatigues rounded the far corner, 30 yards down the hall. They brought their rifles up, shouting overlapping commands. Brill didn't shout. He planted his lead foot, leveled his tritium sights, and fired twice. PFF'd. PFF'd. The suppressor coughed. The lead guard took both 9mm rounds directly through the reinforced visor of his riot helmet. His head snapped back, and he collapsed backward into the man behind him. The third guard swung his barrel wildly toward Brill. Before Brill could transition his aim, a deafening crack shattered the corridor's acoustics. Vance fired a rapid 3-round string over Brill's shoulder. Her grouping was tight, brutal, and exact. The rounds chewed through the guard's unarmored throat and upper chest. He dropped instantly. Brill didn't look back to offer praise. He kept moving, stepping over the fresh corpses. "They're flushing us," Vance said, her voice tight with pain tracking the rear. "Standard containment. They'll block the upper levels and flood the basement." "Let them," Brill replied. They reached a sharp T-junction where the sub-basement split toward the maintenance wings and the primary stairwell. Brill checked the angle. Dozens of overlapping flashlights swept the walls down the left corridor. A massive response team was moving in, attempting to pincer them. Brill holstered his pistol and dropped to one knee. He unvelcroed a tactical pouch on his chest rig and extracted a brick of C4, malleable and dense. He slapped the explosive against a thick, rusted iron steam pipe running vertically along the corner of the junction. He moved fast, his gloved fingers manipulating the blasting cap and a spool of microfilament tripwire. He ran the near-invisible wire across the width of the corridor, anchoring it tightly to a heavy steel door hinge on the opposite wall, exactly 4 inches off the ground. "Clear the junction," Brill ordered. Vance hobbled backward, keeping her rifle trained on the corner while Brill finished the rig. He primed the detonator and retreated, grabbing Vance by the shoulder and dragging her behind a heavy concrete support pillar 20 yards down the hall. The beam of a tactical light cut across the junction. Heavy boots pounded the concrete. "Contact front," a voice bellowed in Russian. The lead element of the Oman squad charged around the corner, shields raised, rifles tracking. The point man's combat boot snagged the microfilament. The C4 detonated. The explosion was catastrophic in the confined space. A localized shockwave of expanding gas and pulverized concrete slammed through the corridor, instantly deafening Brill and Vance. The blast sheared the iron steam pipe clean in half. A geyser of superheated, pressurized white steam erupted into the hallway, mixing with the thick, choking dust of shattered masonry. The shrapnel and concussive force shredded the first 3 rows of the assault team. Their screams were entirely drowned out by the roar of the escaping steam. "Move," Brill commanded, his voice a dull hum in his own ringing ears. They used the chaotic, blinding cloud of steam and dust as concealment. They pushed past the kill zone, Brill firing blind, suppressed shots into the haze to keep any survivors pinned to the floor. Vance fired controlled bursts at moving shadows, her face a mask of cold, agonizing focus. They fought their way down a long, sloping hallway toward a set of reinforced double steel doors marked with a faded, stenciled 1. The primary stairwell. Their only route to the surface. Brill slammed his shoulder into the heavy push bar. The door opened a fraction of an inch. He instantly threw his weight backward, slamming the door shut again, just as a hailstorm of high-velocity rifle fire sparked against the exterior steel plate. Brill pressed his back against the wall next to the doorframe. Vance mirrored him on the opposite side, her breathing ragged, her AK pointed at the ceiling. Through the bullet-pocked gap in the door, Brill saw the reality of their situation. The main stairwell was a massive, multi-level concrete shaft. And it was occupied. 3 overlapping rows of Oman riot police were entrenched on the landing 10 feet above them. They had deployed interlocking, full-body ballistic shields, creating an impenetrable phalanx of black steel and ballistic glass. Between the shields protruded the heavy dark barrels of PKM light machine guns. Dozens of red laser sights cut through the dusty air of the stairwell, all converging directly on the heavy steel doors. There was no flanking maneuver. There was no blind spot. It was a solid wall of overwhelming entrenched firepower blocking the only exit. Brill checked his magazines. He was down to 2. Vance had half a magazine left in her stolen rifle. The heavy thud of a sledgehammer slammed against the outside of the steel doors, followed by the metallic clink of a breaching charge being magnetized to the lock housing. They were trapped. Chapter 11. The metallic, rhythmic chirp of a digital timer bled through the heavy steel doors. 10 seconds until the breaching charge detonated. Brill abandoned the stairwell. An entrenched PKM machine gun nest operating behind ballistic shields was a mathematical impossibility for 2 battered operatives armed with scavenged small arms. Up was no longer an option. He spun away from the door, his eyes scanning the narrow steam-choked corridor. The architecture of Soviet-era sub-basements followed a rigid, utilitarian logic. Interrogation blocks required heavy industrial hosing to wash away the blood and viscera. Water required gravity. In the center of the junction, precisely where the floor gently sloped, sat a massive 4-foot-wide cast-iron drainage grate. Brill crossed the corridor in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside the rusted iron. He hooked his gloved fingers through the thick lattice and hauled upward. The grate was fused to the concrete collar by decades of oxidized metal and hard water calcification. It didn't budge. 5 seconds, Vance rasped, her back pressed flush against the wall, the AK-74U leveled at the trembling steel doors. Brill unspooled a length of high-velocity detonating cord from his tactical rig. He rapidly looped the explosive rope around the outer circumference of the cast-iron collar, tucking it tightly into the recessed groove where metal met concrete. He crimped a standard blasting cap onto the tail of the cord. "Cover," Brill commanded, rolling backward behind the thick concrete support pillar. Vance abandoned her firing stance and dove toward the pillar, sliding on the slick floor to tuck herself tightly against Brill's side. The breaching charge on the stairwell door detonated with a deafening, metallic crack. The massive steel double doors buckled inward, blown off their hinges in a cloud of pulverized mortar and gray smoke. Simultaneously, Brill squeezed his detonator. The det cord snapped with a sharp concussive crack whip. The concentrated, localized explosion sheared the rusted iron bolts and shattered the concrete collar. The heavy grate immediately collapsed inward, plummeting into absolute blackness. A jagged 4-foot hole gaped in the floor. A blast of rancid, freezing air rushed up from the abyss, smelling of raw sewage and stagnant rot. Heavy boots pounded over the ruined stairwell doors. The Oman riot squad surged into the corridor, their overlapping flashlights cutting through the settling dust like solid beams of white light. "Go," Brill said, grabbing Vance by the harness of her tactical rig and shoving her toward the hole. She didn't hesitate. She threw her rifle into the void, crossed her arms over her chest, and stepped off the edge. She vanished into the dark. Brill followed a microsecond later, dropping feet first into the absolute black. The fall lasted just under 2 seconds. 20 feet of empty air. He hit the water. The impact was brutal, jarring his spine, but the temperature was worse. The subterranean water was hovering barely above freezing. It felt like stepping into a wall of solid ice. It instantly drove the breath from his lungs and sent a violent, agonizing shockwave through his central nervous system. He submerged completely, his boots sinking into a foot of thick, suctioning sludge at the bottom of the tunnel. Brill surfaced, gasping quietly, forcing his paralyzed diaphragm to expand. The water crested just above his waist. It was thick, oily, and completely lightless. A heavy splash echoed 3 feet to his left. Vance broke the surface, thrashing wildly for a moment as the thermal shock scrambled her motor functions. Brill reached out in the pitch black, grabbing her jacket collar and hauling her upright before the freezing sludge could drag her under. Her teeth were chattering violently, a rapid, uncontrollable percussion. Above them, the jagged hole in the ceiling glowed with the harsh white light of the tactical flashlights. "Contact lost. Check the floor," a voice barked overhead. 3 Oman guards crowded the edge of the breach, looking down into the drainage shaft. Their flashlight beams hit the churning black water, illuminating the swirling silt and Brill's upturned face. "They are in the sewer." Brill grabbed Vance's shoulder and violently yanked her backward into the lateral tunnel, out of the direct line of sight from the hole. A split second later, the ceiling erupted. The guards opened fire. They didn't aim. They simply pointed their Kalashnikovs downward and dumped their magazines into the shaft. High-velocity 5.45 mm rounds plunged into the black water like a torrential, lethal hailstorm. The impacts created geysers of dirty water, the hydrostatic shock vibrating against Brill's ribs. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire in the enclosed concrete pipe was physically punishing. Sparks showered the water as stray rounds struck the iron sides of the drainage pipe. Brill kept one arm locked around Vance, shielding her body with his own, pressing tight against the slimy, curved brickwork of the lateral tunnel while the barrage tore up the water 10 feet away. The gunfire abruptly ceased as the guards spent their magazines. The hiss of falling water and the metallic clack of fresh magazines being seated echoed down the shaft. "Move," Brill whispered, his voice barely audible over Vance's ragged breathing. They waded deeper into the labyrinth. The current was sluggish but heavily resistant, fighting their every step. The tunnel was a massive 8-foot-wide cylinder of reinforced concrete and Victorian-era brickwork, a relic of Minsk's shifting infrastructure. Total darkness consumed them. Brill reached out, trailing his left hand along the freezing, algae-slicked wall to maintain their bearing, keeping his suppressed pistol raised in his right. Hypothermia was no longer a theoretical risk, it was an active countdown. At this water temperature, they had roughly 15 minutes of functional muscle control before their core temperatures plummeted into the lethal zone. Vance's limp had grown worse, the freezing water amplifying the pain of her injuries. She was leaning heavily on Brill's arm, her movements sluggish. Behind them, back at the drop point, a heavy splash echoed through the pipe. Then, another. The Oman teams were dropping in. Brill accelerated their pace, dragging Vance through the thick sludge. The water level rose to their chests as the tunnel sloped downward. A sudden sharp sound cut through the sloshing of their own movement. It didn't come from the tactical teams dropping into the water. It resonated from a tributary tunnel intersecting their path ahead. It was a deep, guttural bark. It echoed off the wet concrete, a resonant, aggressive roar that vibrated with primal malice. Another bark answered it, closer this time. The sharp clicking of heavy claws scrambling over wet brickwork amplified in the dark. The KGB hadn't just sent riot police into the sewers. They had deployed the Caucasian shepherds. Chapter 12. The deep, resonant barks echoed down the concrete pipe, a stereophonic nightmare amplifying in the dark. Caucasian shepherds were bred to hunt bears in the Ural Mountains. In the enclosed, echoing confines of a sewer main, they were apex predators tracking fresh blood. The water was liquid ice, sucking the heat from their bodies with lethal efficiency. Vance stumbled. Her knee buckled under the frigid current. She slipped beneath the black surface with a faint splash. Brill grabbed the heavy nylon webbing of her tactical harness. He hauled her upright. She came up gasping, her teeth chattering a frantic, uncontrollable rhythm. Her lips were the color of bruised plums. Hypothermia had breached her core. Her motor skills were failing. Brill wrapped his left arm tight around her waist, taking her weight. He dragged her forward through the knee-deep sludge. The barks grew louder. The sharp clicking of heavy claws scrambling over wet brickwork cut through the sloshing of the water. The dogs were pulling their handlers, closing the distance fast. Brill scanned the lightless tunnel. His eyes adjusted to the absolute black, picking up subtle variations in the gloom. Minsk's subterranean infrastructure was a patchwork quilt of decaying eras. The smooth, reinforced Soviet concrete abruptly transitioned into a section of crumbling Victorian-era brickwork. He found a choke point. The tunnel narrowed where an old secondary storm drain merged with the main line. Above the junction, a massive, rusted cast-iron sluice gate hung suspended by a single badly oxidized retaining pin. The surrounding brickwork was bulging, weeping dark water, the mortar eaten away by a century of rot. It was a structural failure waiting for a catalyst. Brill waded to the junction. He shoved Vance into the narrow recess of the secondary drain, pressing her back against the slimy brick. He reached beneath the freezing water. His hands scoured the sludgy bottom, searching the accumulated detritus of the city. His fingers closed around a heavy, 4-foot length of discarded iron rebar. Brill climbed onto a narrow, submerged ledge along the tunnel wall. He jammed the thick rebar directly into the decaying mortar joint beneath the rusted retaining pin of the sluice gate. He wedged the other end against a protruding brick, creating a crude, high-tension lever. A flashlight beam swept the curved wall of the tunnel 50 yards back. The frantic splashing of a massive animal charging through the water echoed in the dark. The first dog rounded the curve. It was a terrifying silhouette of matted fur and muscle, illuminated by the tactical light of the handler waiting behind it. The beast scented Brill instantly. It let out a guttural snarl and lunged. 150 pounds of teeth and kinetic energy launched through the air, aimed directly at Brill's throat. Brill dropped his center of gravity. He met the animal's momentum with a brutal, driving front kick. The flat sole of his tactical boot slammed directly into the dog's sternum. Ribs cracked under the impact. The strike halted the dog's trajectory mid-air, driving the beast backward into the black water. Brill followed immediately. He plunged both hands into the thick fur of the dog's neck, forcing the thrashing head beneath the sludgy surface. The animal fought violently, its heavy claws raking Brill's forearms. Brill pinned the beast to the tunnel floor with his entire body weight, burying his knee into the dog's broken ribs. He held the animal under the freezing mud until the violent churning stopped. He rose from the water, his breath pluming in the freezing air. The handler waited around the curve, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He saw the water churning with mud and blood. He raised his Kalashnikov, searching for a target. Brill gripped the length of iron rebar. He threw his entire body weight backward, pulling the lever. The rusted retaining pin sheared with a sharp, metallic screech. The heavy cast-iron sluice gate plummeted downward. The sudden shift in load-bearing weight shattered the crumbling brick archway. The ceiling gave way. 2 tons of Victorian masonry, rotting timber, and heavy iron collapsed into the tunnel. The handler looked up, his flashlight beam catching the falling avalanche of stone a microsecond before impact. The crushing weight obliterated the handler and sealed the tunnel behind them in a massive churning splash of black water and pulverized brick. A thick cloud of dust rolled over the water, choking the stagnant air. The pursuit was cut off. Brill threw the rebar aside. He waded back into the secondary drain. Vance had slipped down the wall. She was sitting in the freezing water, her eyes half closed, her body rocking with violent, silent tremors. She was shutting down. Brill hauled her out of the water. He hoisted her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, locking his arm around her legs. She was dead weight. He turned away from the collapsed junction and marched deeper into the labyrinth. His own muscles burned with a dull, lactic fire. The freezing water fought his every step, a heavy, sucking drag on his boots. He focused entirely on the rhythm of his movement. One step, then the next. The air moving through the tunnel began to change. The stagnant smell of sewage faded, replaced by the sharp, biting scent of ozone and freezing rain. The tunnel ended abruptly. Brill stepped out of the water and onto a slick concrete ledge. An open 6-foot-wide outflow pipe gaped before them. The wind howled through the opening, carrying tiny, stinging needles of sleet. Brill stepped to the edge and looked down. 30 feet below them, churning with jagged gray ice floes, lay the black expanse of the Svislach River. Chapter 13. The Svislach River was a ribbon of liquid frost. The water ripped the heat from their bodies with vicious, punishing efficiency. Brill hauled Sarah up the muddy embankment, his boots slipping on the slick, frozen clay. She was a dead weight in his grasp. Her core temperature had plummeted into the danger zone. Her lips were a pale, bruised blue, and her violent shivering had given way to a terrifying, sluggish stillness. He dug his fingers into the heavy nylon webbing of her tactical harness and pulled her over the crest of the riverbank. They collapsed into a tangle of dead frost-coated weeds. The night wind howled off the water, cutting through their soaked clothing. It found the bone. Brill forced himself up. Hypothermia was an active, ticking clock. He had a deep well of stamina, built over years of punishing operations, but the cold was an impartial killer. It cared nothing for training. He hoisted Sarah over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. He locked his arm around her legs and began to march. The landscape east of the river was a desolate sprawl of skeletal birch trees and abandoned industrial debris. The snow on the ground was brittle, crunching loudly under his boots. He focused entirely on the rhythm of his movement. He placed one foot in front of the other, pushing through the lactic fire burning in his thighs. Shelby's dossier had listed a secondary off-the-book safe house 3 miles from the Okrestina facility. It was a Cold War relic, maintained by deep cover assets for worst-case scenarios. This qualified. They moved through the skeletal forest for an hour. Brill's wet trousers froze solid, turning the fabric into stiff, abrasive boards that chafed his skin raw with every step. He navigated by the pale, filtered moonlight, keeping the sparse lights of the Minsk suburbs on his left flank. The tree line broke. A small, overgrown clearing emerged from the gloom. In the center sat a decaying timber dacha, an old summer cabin from a bygone era. The roof sagged under a heavy load of snow. The windows were boarded up with rotting plywood. Brill approached from the blind side, staying in the deep shadows of the trees. He lowered Sarah gently into a snowdrift at the edge of the clearing. She slumped forward, her chin resting on her chest, her breathing shallow and ragged. He drew his suppressed pistol and advanced on the cabin. He checked the ground around the foundation for freshly disturbed snow. He swept the doorframe for tripwires or pressure plates. The perimeter was clean. Dust and undisturbed cobwebs coated the heavy iron padlock on the front door. He bypassed the lock. He took a hardened steel pry bar from his tactical rig, wedged it behind the rusted hasp, and threw his weight into it. The rusted screws tore free of the rotting wood with a sharp crack. Brill pushed the door open and stepped inside, slicing his field of vision through the pitch-black interior. The air inside smelled of dust, dry rot, and dead rodents. He cleared the small main room, the tiny kitchen area, and the single rear bedroom. The structure was empty. He went back out into the freezing wind and retrieved Sarah. He carried her inside and set her down on a moth-eaten sofa in the center of the main room. Survival required light and heat. Both were beacons for hunters. Brill weighed the risks and made the only acceptable choice. A cold asset was a dead asset. He moved to the small, cast-iron wood stove in the corner of the room. A stack of dry, dusty firewood sat piled beside it. He loaded the stove, using a handful of dry newspaper from a nearby shelf for tinder. He struck a spark with his lighter. The paper caught, casting a dim, flickering orange glow across the ruined room. He closed the iron door of the stove, leaving the damper open just enough to feed the flames while minimizing the smoke signature from the chimney outside. The cast iron began to tick and ping as the metal expanded. Brill turned his attention back to Sarah. She was leaning forward on the sofa, staring blankly at the floorboards. He unzipped his soaked outer jacket and threw it aside. He knelt in front of her. "Take the wet gear off," Brill ordered. His voice was a low, flat rasp in the quiet cabin. She blinked, her gray eyes struggling to focus on his face. Her fine motor skills were compromised. Her hands shook violently as she reached for the zipper of her heavy tactical jacket. Brill batted her hands away. He gripped the zipper and pulled it down in one sharp motion. He peeled the heavy, soaked jacket off her shoulders. He removed her tactical harness and threw the dripping gear onto the floor. Underneath, she wore a dark, long-sleeved thermal shirt. It was stained with dark, rusty patches of dried blood. Her face was a horrific landscape of deep purple contusions and swelling. The interrogators at Okrestina had been thorough. She wrapped her arms around her chest, leaning closer to the growing heat radiating from the iron stove. The violent shivering returned. This was a good sign. It meant her body was fighting back. Brill retrieved a waterproof medical kit from his own pack. He cracked the plastic seal and laid the contents out on the dusty floorboards. "Show me the worst of it," he said. Sarah took a ragged, trembling breath. She pulled up the left sleeve of her thermal shirt. A deep, jagged laceration ran from her elbow to her wrist. The flesh was torn open, exposing the pale muscle beneath. The edges of the wound were red and inflamed. The filthy water of the sewer system had undoubtedly introduced a massive dose of bacteria into her bloodstream. Brill took a bottle of medical-grade iodine from the kit. He unscrewed the cap and handed it to her. "This is going to burn," he stated. Sarah took the bottle. Her jaw set into a hard, rigid line. She poured the dark brown liquid directly into the open wound. She let out a sharp, strangled hiss of air through her teeth. Her eyes watered, but she made no other sound. She clamped her right hand over her knee, her knuckles turning white with the strain. Brill respected the silence. Pain was just data. She processed it well. He threaded a curved suture needle with heavy black nylon thread. He moved closer, taking her injured arm in his firm, steady grip. He began to stitch the torn flesh back together. He worked with rapid, clinical precision, pulling the thread tight, tying off the knots with quick, sharp movements. Sarah watched his hands. "You move like a combat medic," she rasped. Her voice was shredded from screaming in Volkov's interrogation room. "I move like a man who patches holes," Brill replied. He snipped the final thread with his combat knife and wiped the excess iodine away with a gauze pad. He wrapped the arm tightly in a clean pressure bandage. He tossed a packet of broad-spectrum antibiotics into her lap. "Take 2. Chew them if you don't have enough saliva to swallow." She ripped the foil packet open with her teeth and swallowed the pills dry. She leaned her head back against the rotting upholstery of the sofa. The heat from the stove was finally beginning to penetrate the freezing air of the cabin. The color was slowly returning to her bruised face. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind outside the boarded windows. Brill sat on a wooden crate opposite the sofa. He began to break down the stolen PP-19 submachine gun, wiping the moisture and river grit from the bolt carrier with a dry rag. "Shelby Johnson sent you," Sarah said. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes." My handler reached out to him. "He called in a favor," Brill confirmed. He slapped the bolt back into the receiver and racked the weapon. The metallic clack was loud in the small room. "He said you missed your check-ins. He said you were operating outside your primary parameters." Sarah let out a harsh, bitter laugh. The sound scraped against her raw throat. "He told Shelby I went rogue." "Did you?" She looked at him, her gray eyes locking onto his with a fierce, burning intensity. "I found a ghost pipeline. High-end NATO hardware flowing straight through Minsk, disappearing into the black market. Millions of dollars in serialized weaponry." "I found the ledgers on your SD card," Brill said. "I saw Director Volkov's face." "Volkov is the transit authority," Sarah said. She leaned forward, the exhaustion in her posture suddenly replaced by a coiled, furious energy. "He takes his cut to ensure the border guards look the other way. He provides the secure warehouses. But he isn't the architect." Brill stopped cleaning the weapon. He met her gaze. "Who is the architect?" "The KDB swept my apartment 10 minutes after I uploaded that data to the dead drop," Sarah whispered. Her hands clenched into tight fists on her lap. "They knew exactly where to look. They bypassed my primary cover instantly. They didn't stumble onto me. They were guided." She took a slow, painful breath. "The local security apparatus never looked my way, Brill. My cover was flawless. The only person who knew my exact location, my exact operational focus, and my communication protocols was the man sitting in Langley." Brill processed the intelligence. The parameters of the mission shifted violently. Shelby's contact. The CIA handler. The old friend from Beirut, who had called in a blood debt to initiate this rescue. "Your handler burned you," Brill stated. Sarah nodded, a single sharp motion. "He isn't trying to save me. He's the broker for the entire pipeline. He's selling the hardware to Volkov. When I found the shipping manifests, I became a massive liability. He didn't send you here to pull me out. He sent me here to confirm you were dead," Brill finished the thought. "To sanitize the site." "Exactly," she breathed. "He used Shelby to dispatch a cleaner. If I was still alive in Okrestina, he knew a ghost would get inside and finish the job Volkov started." The pieces locked into a grim, coherent picture. The impossible nature of the infiltration. The lack of any official support. Shelby had been manipulated by an old friend. The rescue mission was a disguised execution order. Brill sat perfectly still. He evaluated the new reality. The safe house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a destination provided by a man who wanted them dead. The handler knew about this cabin. Brill stood up abruptly. He grabbed a bucket of dirty, frozen mop water sitting near the door. "Get your gear on," he ordered. He threw the dirty water directly into the cast iron stove. The fire hissed and died in a violent cloud of gray steam. The cabin plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The sudden drop in temperature was immediate. "What is it?" Sarah whispered in the dark. "We're standing on a giant red X," Brill replied softly. He moved to the boarded-up front window. He peered through a narrow crack in the rotting plywood. The clearing outside was dark, the skeletal birch trees swaying in the violent wind. The snow was a smooth, unbroken blanket of white. Then, the ambient noise of the forest changed. The howling of the wind was a constant, but a new, subtle frequency layered beneath it. It was the faint, rhythmic crunch of heavy boots moving over frozen snow. Not a clumsy patrol. The footfalls were disciplined, spaced out, moving with deliberate, tactical precision. The cadence belonged to professional operators, closing a net. A tiny, brilliant ruby dot danced across the rotting timber of the cabin wall, just inches from Brill's face. A laser sight, cutting through the blowing snow. "They are here," Brill whispered. The glass of the rear bedroom window shattered inward with a deafening crash. A heavy, cylindrical object bounced across the wooden floorboards and rolled into the main room. Brill recognized the shape in the gloom. A stun grenade. "Down!" he roared, grabbing Sarah and throwing her to the floor behind the heavy bulk of the sofa. The flashbang detonated with a catastrophic, blinding burst of white light and a concussive boom that rocked the foundation of the old cabin. Chapter 14. The concussive blast of the stun grenade was a physical hammer strike against the chest. The detonation vaporized the darkness, searing the retinas with a blinding, catastrophic flash of white light. The overpressure waves slammed into the walls of the decaying cabin, rattling the rotting timber, and sending a thick cloud of centuries-old dust cascading from the ceiling. Brill's ears registered a high-pitched mechanical whine, completely drowning out the ambient howl of the wind outside. The air instantly tasted of burnt magnesium, pulverized plaster, and the coppery tang of ozone. He absorbed the sensory overload. He forced his breathing into a slow, controlled rhythm, anchoring his central nervous system against the physiological shock. He reached out blindly in the settling dust. His leather-gloved hands found the heavy nylon webbing of Sarah's tactical harness. He gripped the thick material and hauled her backward. He dragged her across the rough floorboards, pulling her away from the exposed center of the room and sliding her behind the massive cast-iron bulk of the dead wood stove. The white afterimage burned itself out of his vision, plunging the cabin back into absolute impenetrable blackness. He assessed the spatial layout of the structure from memory. A single front door. One boarded-up window in the main room. One shattered window in the rear bedroom. A narrow, connecting hallway. The architecture dictated the enemy's approach. The private military contractors would attempt a simultaneous, multi-point breach to overwhelm the defenders and flood the confined space with kinetic energy. Brill needed to break their synchronization. He required force multipliers. He left Sarah huddled behind the iron stove. He moved across the main room, his soft-soled tactical boots making zero sound on the dusty floorboards. He navigated entirely by touch and spatial awareness. He reached the heavy, splintered front door. The rusted iron deadbolt remained engaged, but the surrounding wood was compromised. The strike team outside would utilize a kinetic ram to force entry. Brill slung his captured PP-19 submachine gun across his back. He reached into his tactical pack and retrieved a single 12-gauge shotgun shell. He knelt beside the door frame. He wedged the heavy plastic hull of the shell deep into a wide, rotting crack between two floorboards, positioning the brass primer directly facing the door hinge. He extracted a long, rusted framing nail from his pocket, scavenged earlier from the ruined kitchen cabinets. He placed the sharp tip of the nail flush against the center of the shotgun shell's brass primer. He unspooled a length of high-tensile Kevlar tripwire from his wrist pouch. He looped the wire tightly around the rusted iron hasp of the deadbolt. He ran the thin, near-invisible line down to the floor, wrapping it securely around the head of the rusted nail. He pulled the line taut, adjusting the friction until the tension was perfectly balanced. A dynamic entry would throw the heavy door inward. The motion would yank the Kevlar line. The line would drive the nail directly into the primer. The firing pin substitute would detonate the 12-gauge shell at shin level, sending a concentrated cloud of double-aught buckshot straight into the breach point. Brill abandoned the front door and retreated into the narrow hallway. He dropped to his knees and ran his hands over the peeling linoleum floor of the tiny kitchen alcove. He located a heavy glass mason jar sitting abandoned in the corner. He wrapped the jar in a thick layer of filthy rags and crushed it beneath the heel of his combat boot. He spread the muffled, jagged shards of glass across the threshold of the rear bedroom. He created a crude, acoustic alarm system. He pulled a heavy, solid oak dining chair from the kitchen and wedged it tightly beneath the handle of the bathroom door, creating a false barricade. He faded into the deep shadows of the hallway, pressing his spine against the cold, damp drywall. He drew his suppressed Sig Sauer pistol. He waited in the dark. Outside, the heavy, disciplined footfalls stopped. The crunch of boots on the frozen snow ceased entirely. The strike team was in position. They were stacked up on the primary and secondary entry points. The silence stretched, heavy and pregnant with impending violence. The countdown reached 0. A deafening, splintering crash shattered the quiet of the main room. A heavy steel battering ram slammed into the front door. The rotting wood around the deadbolt sheared away completely. The door flew inward, crashing violently against the interior wall. The Kevlar line snapped taut. The rusted nail drove deep into the brass primer. The 12-gauge shotgun shell detonated with a catastrophic, booming roar in the confined entryway. A dense, lethal cloud of lead buckshot tore through the air precisely at knee height. The point man of the entry team absorbed the full force of the blast. The heavy lead pellets shredded his armored shin guards and shattered his tibia. The man let out a high, ragged shriek of agony. He collapsed backward, his heavy tactical gear crashing into the man stacked directly behind him. The synchronized assault shattered. The front entry team fell into a chaotic, tangled heap on the snow-covered porch, their momentum entirely halted by the improvised booby trap. Simultaneously, the rear entry team breached the back bedroom. Heavy boots crunched over the broken glass of the window frame. 2 men dropped onto the floorboards. Faint, green luminescent glows radiated from the dual-tube night vision goggles strapped to their tactical helmets. They owned the darkness. The first contractor stepped out of the bedroom and into the narrow hallway. His heavy combat boot pressed down on the scattered shards of the crushed mason jar. The glass ground against the linoleum with a sharp, distinct crunch. Brill acted instantly. He stayed low, dipping entirely beneath the contractor's horizontal plane of sight. He closed the distance in a single, fluid stride. He bypassed his firearm, utilizing the structural confines of the narrow hallway to limit the enemy's maneuverability. He drove his left forearm upward, striking the contractor's weapon barrel and forcing the muzzle of the assault rifle toward the ceiling. Simultaneously, Brill delivered a devastating, piston-like punch with his right fist. He targeted the vulnerable nerve cluster of the brachial plexus, buried deep in the contractor's exposed armpit. The strike carried the force of a swinging hammer. The kinetic impact scrambled the enemy's central nervous system. The contractor's right arm went entirely numb, dropping the heavy rifle instantly. Brill followed the strike with a brutal, driving knee directly to the side of the man's thigh. The peroneal nerve ruptured under the impact. The contractor's leg buckled completely. As the man collapsed forward, Brill caught him by the heavy nylon of his tactical vest. He guided the unconscious, 200-pound body silently to the floorboards, eliminating any secondary acoustic warning. The second contractor remained in the back bedroom. He swept his suppressed submachine gun across the empty room, the green laser of his aiming module painting the peeling wallpaper. He whispered a sharp, urgent command into his throat microphone, requesting a status update from his fallen partner. The radio emitted only static. The contractor stepped cautiously toward the hallway threshold. He sliced the angle, inching his weapon barrel around the doorframe. Brill grabbed the heavy wooden leg of a broken table lying near the kitchen entrance. He hurled the jagged piece of timber across the hallway. The wood slammed hard into the bathroom door, creating a loud, aggressive clatter. The contractor spun toward the noise. He raised his weapon, tracking the sound, his night vision goggles entirely focused on the false barricade at the end of the hall. Brill lunged from the opposite side of the doorway. He grabbed the barrel of the contractor's submachine gun, ripping the weapon violently downward and out of the man's grasp. The contractor reacted with professional speed. He abandoned the lost rifle and drew a heavy fixed-blade combat knife from his chest rig. He thrust the weapon forward in a vicious upward arc aimed at Brill's ribs. Brill sidestepped the blade smoothly. He trapped the contractor's knife arm, pinning the man's wrist against his own chest. He applied a savage, twisting torque to the joint. The radius bone popped with a wet, audible snap. The contractor gasped, his knees sagging under the sudden agonizing pain. Brill wrapped his free arm around the back of the man's neck, securing him in a tight, inescapable clinch. He drove the crown of his head forward, delivering a brutal headbutt directly to the bridge of the contractor's nose. Cartilage shattered. The man went entirely limp, his eyes rolling back beneath the glowing lenses of his night vision goggles. Brill lowered him to the ground. 2 men down. The front room remained a chaotic scene of shouted orders and groans of pain. The survivors of the primary entry team had dragged their wounded point man away from the porch. They recognized the lethal nature of the close-quarters environment. They abandoned the kinetic breach. A heavy, metallic cylinder bounced across the threshold of the front door. It skittered across the dusty floorboards and rolled to a stop just inches from the cast-iron stove where Sarah remained hidden. Brill recognized the ribbed, olive-drab casing instantly. A fragmentation grenade. He sprinted down the hallway. He dove across the main room, his body fully extended. He hit the floorboards sliding, kicking the heavy iron door of the wood stove wide open. He grabbed the fragmentation grenade, tossed the explosive directly into the belly of the cold stove, and slammed the iron door shut. He threw his body over Sarah, covering her with his own tactical vest. The grenade detonated inside the heavy cast-iron chamber. The muffled, booming explosion rocked the cabin. The stove absorbed the deadly shrapnel entirely, trapping the lethal fragments within its thick metal walls. The heavy iron door buckled outward slightly, groaning under the immense internal pressure, but the seal held. A thick cloud of gray smoke billowed from the chimney pipe. The private military contractors outside fell silent. The assault paused. The initial breach had failed. The fragmentation grenade had failed. They were fighting a phantom in a maze of traps. A sharp, authoritative voice barked a new command from the tree line. It was the clear, commanding tone of Sarah's CIA handler, the old friend from Beirut. He was directing the operation personally. The tactical approach shifted completely. The footfalls retreated, pulling away from the immediate perimeter of the cabin. Brill rose to his feet. He pulled Sarah up, keeping her low against the wall. The air was thick with the smell of explosive residue and ancient dust. "They are falling back," Sarah whispered, her voice a raw, shredded rasp. She gripped the scavenged Makarov pistol tightly. "They are changing the parameters of the fight," Brill replied. He kept his eyes locked on the shattered front doorway. A heavy, mechanical thud echoed from the darkness outside. It was a distinct, rhythmic sound. The unmistakable, metallic cycle of a 40-millimeter grenade launcher. A projectile launched through the air with a soft whistle. It punched directly through the rotting plywood of the boarded-up front window. The round struck the center of the main room, embedding itself deep into the floorboards. The projectile did not explode with concussive, kinetic force. It detonated with a blinding, searing flare of impossible white light. A fountain of burning chemical compound erupted from the casing. White phosphorus. The incendiary substance burned at over 5,000 degrees. The white-hot fragments splashed across the dry, rotting timber of the cabin walls and the ancient upholstery of the discarded sofa. The structure caught fire instantly. The flames roared to life with a ravenous, crackling intensity, devouring the dry wood with terrifying speed. The ambient temperature inside the small cabin spiked brutally within seconds. Thick, toxic, pitch-black smoke began to billow from the burning floorboards, rapidly filling the confined space and choking the stagnant air. The CIA handler had abandoned the surgical strike. He had deployed an area denial weapon. He was reducing the safe house to ash. Chapter 15. The interior of the cabin was a sudden, roaring furnace. White phosphorus burns with an apocalyptic intensity, chewing through oxygen and generating temperatures high enough to melt steel. The chemical splashed across the rotting floorboards, igniting the dry timber instantly. The air filled with the sharp, overwhelming stench of garlic and burning matches. Thick, toxic, pitch-black smoke banked against the low ceiling, rolling downward in a suffocating wave. Brill felt the blistering heat radiating against his face. The main room was entirely compromised. The front door was a wall of white fire. He dropped to his knees, staying beneath the descending smoke layer. He grabbed the heavy nylon webbing of Sarah's tactical vest and hauled her flat against the floorboards. "The roof," Brill rasped, coughing out a lungful of acrid smoke. "Move." He dragged her toward the tiny rear kitchen alcove. The ceiling here sloped downward, framed by exposed rotting rafters. Above the rusted stove, a square wooden access panel covered a small attic crawlspace. Brill stood up. The heat was a physical pressure against his skin. He drove the heavy steel pommel of his combat knife into the center of the wooden panel. The rotted plywood splintered and gave way. He hooked his gloved fingers over the edge of the opening and pulled his body upward, hauling himself into the suffocating darkness of the attic. The space was cramped, choked with centuries of dust and dry rot. The heat from the fire below was baking the floorboards beneath his boots. He reached down through the hatch, grabbed Sarah by the wrists, and hauled her up into the crawlspace. At the far end of the attic, a small wooden louvered vent opened to the outside. Brill crawled toward it, his shoulders scraping against the rusted nails protruding from the roof decking. He kicked the wooden slats with the flat sole of his tactical boot. The brittle wood shattered outward. A blast of freezing, sub-zero air rushed into the attic, cutting through the stifling heat. Brill pushed his head and shoulders through the narrow opening. The wind howled against his face, stinging his eyes with tiny jagged crystals of sleet. He wriggled his body out onto the steep, icy pitch of the cabin roof. He grabbed the broken frame of the vent, reached back inside, and pulled Sarah out into the freezing storm. The roof decking groaned under their combined weight. The fire below was consuming the structural supports. They slid down the icy shingles, dropping the final 10 feet into a massive, waist-deep snowdrift piled against the rear foundation of the cabin. The soft, powdery snow absorbed their impact entirely. Brill hauled Sarah upright. Her breathing was ragged, her face smeared with black soot, but her gray eyes were sharp and focused. The adrenaline was masking her pain. "The tree line," Brill commanded. He took the lead. The snow was a heavy, sucking drag against his thighs. He broke the crust, carving a deep trench through the drift, pushing toward the dense skeletal birch forest that bordered the clearing. He guided her path over exposed rocks and the thick, frozen trunks of fallen pines, minimizing the depth and visibility of their tracks. They reached the edge of the woods and plunged into the deep shadows of the trees. Brill turned and looked back at the clearing. The cabin was a roaring pillar of blinding white fire. The flames licked at the sky, casting erratic dancing shadows across the pristine snow. Against the brilliant backdrop of the inferno, the silhouettes of the private military contractors were stark and sharp. There were 6 men remaining. They fanned out across the clearing, their assault rifles raised, moving with disciplined, tactical spacing. Faint green glows radiated from the optical tubes of their night vision goggles. They owned the visual spectrum. Brill needed to change the rules of the engagement. He moved deeper into the forest, guiding Sarah through a dense thicket of frozen rhododendrons. He found a massive, uprooted spruce tree. The massive root ball had pulled away from the earth, creating a deep, natural depression shielded by a thick canopy of dead, snow-laden branches. He pushed her down into the hollow. The snow had drifted over the roots, creating a perfectly insulated, acoustically dead blind. He handed her the scavenged Makarov pistol. He pressed her thumb against the safety selector, ensuring she felt the tactile click of the weapon going hot. "Stay low," Brill ordered softly. "Do not engage unless they break the perimeter of these roots." Sarah gripped the pistol tightly with both hands. She gave a single, firm nod. Brill stripped off his heavy tactical backpack. He left the stolen submachine gun resting against the dirt. Excess weight restricted mobility. Heavy weapons created noise. He required absolute, frictionless silence. He kept his suppressed Sig Sauer holstered at the small of his back, but his hand rested comfortably on the textured grip of his fixed-blade combat knife. He stepped away from the root ball and melted into the deep frozen darkness of the woods. The hunted was gone. The predator remained. The footfalls of the contractors crunched heavily on the frozen crust of the snow. They were entering the tree line, spreading out in a wide, sweeping arc. They communicated through sub-vocal throat microphones, their movements coordinated and lethal. Brill assessed their hardware. The dual-tube night vision goggles amplified ambient light, turning the dark forest into a bright green landscape. They would spot the dark contrast of his tactical uniform instantly against the white snow. Furthermore, high-end private contractors often utilized thermal overlays. They would be searching for the bright, white-hot bloom of a human body signature. Brill dropped to his knees behind the thick trunk of an ancient oak. He unzipped the front of his tactical jacket. He plunged his bare hands into the deep snowdrift, scooping up massive handfuls of the freezing, powdery ice. He packed the snow directly against his thermal undershirt, pressing the freezing slush against his chest, his stomach, and the major arteries of his neck. The physiological shock was immediate and agonizing. The cold bit into his flesh like thousands of tiny needles. His central nervous system screamed in protest, demanding warmth. He walled the pain off. He processed the agonizing cold purely as tactical data. The snow rapidly dropped his core surface temperature, masking his thermal bloom from the searching optics. He re-zipped his jacket and drew his combat knife. The blackened steel blade caught no light. A lone contractor advanced along the far right flank of the sweep. The man moved carefully, slicing the visual angles around the thick tree trunks, his rifle tracking his line of sight. Brill stepped entirely behind the oak tree. He let his breathing slow to a shallow, silent rhythm. He listened to the crunch of the man's boots. 10 yards. 5 yards. 2. As the contractor stepped past the trunk of the oak, exposing his back, Brill struck. He bypassed the traditional rear chokehold. The thick collar of the man's tactical vest offered too much protection. Instead, Brill dropped his center of gravity. He delivered a brutal, driving kick with the reinforced toe of his boot directly into the back of the contractor's left knee joint. The joint ruptured with a wet, audible snap. The man's leg buckled entirely. As he collapsed backward, Brill caught the heavy Kevlar rim of the man's tactical helmet. He twisted violently, using the man's own falling momentum to drive his face downward. Brill brought his right knee up in a devastating, piston-like strike. The heavy knee pad connected flush with the bridge of the contractor's nose. Bone shattered instantly. The kinetic shock scrambled the man's brainstem, shutting off his central nervous system before a single cry of pain could escape his throat. Brill caught the heavy assault rifle before it hit the snow. He lowered the lifeless, 200-pound body silently to the frozen earth. He reached down and stripped the radio earpiece from the dead man's tactical harness. He slotted the earpiece into his own ear. "Flank is clear," a clipped professional voice hissed through the static. Moving to grid sector 4. Keep your spacing tight. It was the squad leader. He was coordinating a pincer movement, attempting to herd his prey toward the center of the woods. Brill left the dead man in the snow. He moved with swift, fluid strides, utilizing the shadows cast by the skeletal birch trees. He intercepted the northern arm of the pincer sweep. Two contractors were moving in tandem, covering each other's blind spots. They were 10 yards apart, sweeping their rifles across the low brush. Brill looked up. The thick, sturdy branch of a dead pine tree stretched across their path, 10 feet above the forest floor. He scaled the rough, frozen bark of the trunk with silent, measured pulls. He perched on the heavy branch, blending his dark uniform against the black timber. The two men passed directly beneath him. Brill waited for the trailing man to step under his position. He dropped a heavy, frozen pine cone from his hand. It struck the crust of the snow, 20 feet to the left of the contractors with a sharp, distinct crunch. Both men pivoted instantly, raising their rifles toward the sound, their night vision goggles tracking the empty brush. Brill stepped off the branch. Gravity did the work. He dropped directly behind the trailing man. He bypassed his knife. He unspooled a length of high-tensile Kevlar wire from his wrist pouch. As his boots hit the snow, he whipped the wire over the man's head, looping it tightly around the exposed throat, above the tactical collar. Brill crossed his wrists and pulled backward with savage force. The Kevlar wire bit deep into the flesh, crushing the windpipe and sealing the carotid arteries instantly. He used the choking man as a heavy, thrashing shield, driving a knee into the contractor's lower spine to maintain control. The lead contractor heard the scuffle. He spun back around, bringing his rifle up. Brill drew his suppressed Sig Sauer pistol from the small of his back. He bypassed the heavy ceramic trauma plates, protecting the man's chest entirely. He raised the weapon and fired 2 rapid, suppressed rounds directly into the glowing green ocular tubes of the man's night vision goggles. The heavy 9mm rounds shattered the glass lenses, plunging through the expensive optics and penetrating deep into the orbital bone. The lead contractor dropped like a stone, dead before his body hit the snow. Brill maintained his brutal grip on the Kevlar wire until the struggling man in his arms went completely limp. He unwrapped the wire and let the second body fall into the red-stained snow. 3 men down. 3 remaining. The radio earpiece erupted with frantic chatter. Echo 2, report, the squad leader barked. Echo 3, report your status. Talk to me. Only static, answered the command. The disciplined coordination of the sweep shattered. The silence of the forest was a heavy, terrifying weight against their eardrums. The hunters realized they were bleeding out in the dark. Pull back, the leader shouted into the radio, panic finally bleeding into his professional tone. Form a defensive perimeter at the rally point. Move. Brill tracked the sound of the leader's voice. The man was abandoning the systematic search. He was retreating, moving quickly through the brush, trying to consolidate his remaining forces. Brill accelerated his pace. He cut a lateral path through the woods, moving to intercept the retreating squad leader before he could link up with his surviving men. He found a narrow, natural choke point in the terrain. 2 massive granite boulders formed a tight passage, flanked by impenetrable walls of frozen thorn bushes. The squad leader had to pass through this gap to reach the clearing. Brill scaled the rough face of the granite boulder on the right side of the passage. He lay flat against the freezing stone, his body a dark, motionless smear against the rock. The heavy, frantic crunch of boots approached the gap. The squad leader jogged into view. He was sweeping his rifle left and right, his breathing loud and ragged in the quiet woods. His night vision goggles glowed ominously, searching for a target he could understand. He stepped into the narrow passage between the boulders. Brill launched himself from the top of the granite rock. He descended like a falling anvil. He landed squarely on the squad leader's shoulders. The immense kinetic impact drove the man face first into the frozen earth. The heavy assault rifle clattered away across the ice, sliding out of reach. The leader grunted in shock, trying to buck the heavy weight off his back. He reached for the fixed-blade combat knife strapped to his chest rig. Brill pinned the man's left arm with his knee. He grabbed the leader's right wrist, locking his own hands around the joint, and applied a brutal upward torque against the natural rotation of the shoulder. The rotator cuff tore with a sickening wet rip of flesh and cartilage. The shoulder joint dislocated completely. The squad leader let out a raw, agonizing scream, his body going limp against the frozen dirt. Brill hauled the man upward by the heavy nylon webbing of his tactical vest, forcing him to his knees. He drew his own combat knife and pressed the razor-sharp edge of the blackened steel directly against the unarmored skin of the man's carotid artery. He applied just enough pressure to draw a thin, hot bead of blood. "Call them off," Brill whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rasp against the man's ear. "Or you bleed out in the snow." Chapter 16. Brill dragged the unconscious squad leader deep into the dense black heart of the Belarusian pine forest. The mercenary weighed over 200 pounds in his full tactical harness, but Brill hauled the dead weight through the knee-deep snow with relentless, machine-like efficiency. His boots punched heavy, rhythmic holes in the crust of the ice. Behind him, Sarah followed the freshly carved trail. She moved with a pronounced, dragging limp, her breath pluming in short, ragged bursts of white vapor. She kept the scavenged Kalashnikov raised and tracking their rear, sweeping the dark gaps between the towering tree trunks. The distant, angry orange glow of the burning safe house painted the low-hanging clouds behind them, casting long, warped shadows through the timber. Brill stopped in a small, natural clearing, surrounded by ancient, tightly clustered evergreens. The canopy overhead was thick enough to block the moonlight and the falling snow, leaving the ground covered in a dry, rust-colored bed of dead pine needles. He dropped the squad leader roughly onto the frozen earth. Without a word, Brill stripped the man of his tactical gear. He unclipped the heavy ceramic plate carrier and tossed it aside. He emptied the man's pockets, discarding spare magazines, a tactical flashlight, and a serrated combat folder. Brill found a 50-foot coil of olive-drab paracord lashed to the back of the mercenary's webbing. He unspooled it with rapid, precise movements. He hauled the unconscious man upright, pressing his spine flush against the thick, sap-crusted trunk of a massive pine tree. Working with absolute clinical focus, Brill bound the man to the tree. He wrapped the cord around the mercenary's chest, pinning his upper arms to the bark. He ran the line down to the wrists, lashing them tight against the mercenary's thighs. He secured the legs with individual, locking slipknots around the ankles, pulling the slack until the nylon bit deeply into the fabric of the man's trousers. The bindings were structural, designed to use the man's own body weight and muscle spasms to tighten the knots. Sarah leaned against a neighboring tree, favoring her uninjured leg. She watched Brill work, her face pale and drawn in the ambient darkness. She recognized the setup. It was a textbook field interrogation site, isolated and secure. Brill crouched in front of the captive. The mercenary's head rolled forward on his chest. Brill initiated the wake-up protocol. He extended his right hand, forming a rigid structure with his index and middle knuckles. He drove the knuckles hard into the sternum of the unconscious man, applying intense, localized friction to the bone. The squad leader gasped, a violent rattling intake of freezing air. His eyes snapped open, wide and disoriented. His pupils dilated in the darkness, struggling to focus on the shape crouched in front of him. He instinctively jerked his arms forward, attempting to raise a defense. The paracord snapped taut against the bark, instantly biting into his wrists and chest. The realization of his captivity hit him simultaneously with the crushing pain in his sternum. He was a professional. The panic lasted less than a second before his training took over. He stilled his body, controlling his breathing, locking his jaw, and glaring down at Brill. Brill remained perfectly still. He let the silence stretch. He allowed the absolute isolation of the freezing forest to press down on the man. The ambient temperature hovered near 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind howled through the upper branches, dropping the wind chill well below zero. Brill reached out and unzipped the mercenary's heavy winter parka, pulling the thick material wide open to expose the thin, sweat-soaked thermal base layer underneath. He drew his combat knife. The steel slid from the kydex sheath with a soft, metallic whisper. The mercenary's eyes tracked the blade. His muscles tensed in anticipation of a cut. Brill used the razor-sharp tip to slice through the laces of the man's heavy winter boots. He pulled the boots off and tossed them into the snow. He used the blade again to slice away the thick wool socks, leaving the man's bare feet planted directly on the frozen, ice-slicked roots of the pine tree. Brill peeled the tactical gloves from the man's hands, exposing his bare fingers to the biting air. Hypothermia operates on a predictable biological timeline, Brill stated. His voice was a flat, even murmur, devoid of any anger or malice. It was the tone of a mechanic diagnosing a failing engine. At this exact temperature, with your extremities exposed and your core insulation compromised, your body will initiate extreme vasoconstriction within 6 minutes. It will pull all the heated blood from your hands and feet to protect your vital organs. The mercenary sneered, a defiant curl of his cracked lips. Go to hell. Brill ignored the comment. At 10 minutes, the fluid in your cellular tissue will begin to crystallize. Frostbite will set in. The pain in your fingers and toes will feel like crushed glass circulating through your veins. At 15 minutes, the pain will stop. The tissue will die. Necrosis will begin. Even if a surgeon finds you within the hour, you will spend the rest of your life eating through a straw and moving in a wheelchair. I know the drill, the mercenary spat, his breath pluming in the dark. I'm not telling you a damn thing. Volkov's men will track the smoke from the house. They are already coming. Brill stepped forward, closing the distance until his face was inches from the captive. Volkov's men are dead or burning, Brill whispered. You are alone in the woods. And the cold is only the baseline. Brill raised the combat knife. He reversed his grip, pointing the heavy steel pommel toward the man's exposed left hand. He isolated the man's index finger, gripping it firmly just below the middle knuckle. He aligned the steel pommel directly over the distal interphalangeal joint, the fragile hinge near the fingertip. Where is the final transfer taking place? Brill asked. The mercenary locked eyes with Brill, his jaw clamped shut in silent refusal. Brill drove the heavy steel pommel downward in a short, brutal arc. The sound of the cartilage and bone shattering was a wet, sharp crack in the quiet forest. The mercenary screamed, a raw primal sound of absolute agony. His body bucked violently against the tree, the paracord groaning under the sudden, explosive tension. His head whipped back, slamming against the pine bark. Brill maintained his grip on the ruined finger, locking it in place to ensure every micro-tremor of the man's hand sent agonizing shockwaves through the shattered nerve endings. He waited for the screaming to subside into a ragged, guttural wheeze. The timeline for your core temperature continues to drop, Brill stated calmly, watching the sweat begin to freeze on the man's forehead. Your body is currently flooding your system with adrenaline to manage the pain in your hand. This accelerates your heart rate, which pumps your remaining body heat out into the freezing air much faster. You are killing yourself at an accelerated rate. Brill shifted his grip on the knife, bringing the razor edge of the blade up to hover a fraction of an inch from the mercenary's left eye. Where is the transfer taking place? Brill repeated. The squad leader squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving rapidly. The severe cold was already changing the color of his bare feet, turning the skin a mottled, waxy yellow. His teeth began to chatter, a frantic, uncontrollable percussion echoing in the dark clearing. Bite me, the man forced through his shivering jaw, fully committed to his training. Brill accepted the answer. He lowered the knife from the eye and moved to the man's right side. He sheathed the blade. He reached out with his bare hands, locating the specific anatomical juncture where the collarbone met the shoulder joint. He drove his reinforced thumb deep into the brachial plexus, the dense network of nerves controlling the arm and hand. He applied exact, crushing pressure against the nerve bundle, grinding it directly against the bone. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The mercenary's entire right arm spasmed violently, seizing in a rigid, agonizing cramp. A high-pitched, reedy sound tore from the man's throat. His eyes rolled back, showing the whites, as the sheer voltage of the localized pain overloaded his central nervous system. Brill held the pressure for exactly 10 seconds, hovering the man right on the edge of a pain-induced blackout. Then he released his thumb. The mercenary slumped forward as far as the ropes allowed, gasping for air, drool spilling from the corner of his mouth. His right arm hung completely useless, paralyzed by the nerve strike. Sarah watched from the shadows. She had witnessed interrogations in black sites in Kandahar and safe houses in Bogotá. She had seen men break under waterboards and sleep deprivation. But Brill's methodology terrified her. There was no emotion. No anger, no sadism, no ego. It was the terrifying, unstoppable application of physics and anatomy, wielded by a ghost. Brill retrieved the combat knife. He stepped back to the man's ruined left hand. He grabbed the middle finger, isolating the second joint. "Where is the handler?" Brill asked. The mercenary looked at Brill. The defiance in his eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow, frantic terror. He recognized he was not dealing with a soldier or an intelligence officer bound by rules of engagement or extraction timelines. He was tethered to a machine that would dismantle him piece by piece until he was a pile of frozen, screaming meat. "Stop," the man gasped, his voice breaking. "Stop." Brill paused, holding the knife perfectly still. "The rail yard," the mercenary wheezed, his breath catching on the pain radiating from his shattered hand. "Minsk Passagersky. The industrial siding on the east perimeter. Track 9. "When?" Brill demanded. "Tonight. 2 hours from now," the man confessed, the words spilling out in a desperate rush. "Volkov is bringing the hardware in a decommissioned maintenance train. He wants it out of the city before sunrise." "And the CIA handler?" Brill pressed, keeping his grip firm on the man's finger. "He will be there," the squad leader choked out, shivering violently as the hypothermia rapidly accelerated. "He is bringing the bearer bonds. The final payment for the entire pipeline. Volkov hands over the javelins, the American hands over the briefcase. That's the deal." "How many men?" "Just Volkov's personal detail," the mercenary answered, his head dropping forward. 10, maybe 12 shooters. Spetsnaz veterans. Heavily armed. They are locking down the perimeter. Brill processed the intelligence. The timeline was tight. The location was an exposed, heavily fortified industrial complex. He released the man's hand and stepped back. The mercenary slumped against the ropes, drawing in ragged, freezing breaths. I told you everything. Now cut me down." Brill looked at the man. He considered the tactical variables. Leaving the man tied to the tree meant he would freeze to death in less than an hour, screaming in the dark. Cutting him down and leaving him meant he could potentially find a way to alert Volkov, compromising the final assault. Brill operated on absolutes. He stepped directly behind the tree. He reached his hands around the trunk, placing his left palm flat against the mercenary's chin and his right forearm flush against the base of the man's skull. The mercenary's eyes widened in sudden realization. He opened his mouth to scream. Brill twisted his hands with explosive, violent torque, applying maximum leverage against the cervical spine. A sharp, distinct crack echoed through the frozen clearing. The squad leader's body went instantly limp, all muscle tension vanishing. His head lolled sharply to the side at an unnatural angle. Brill stepped away from the tree. He wiped his gloved hands on his jacket. He turned to look at Sarah. She was staring at the corpse, her expression unreadable in the dim light, her grip tight on her scavenged rifle. "Are you combat effective?" Brill asked, his voice returning to a flat, professional monotone. Sarah looked up at him. She adjusted the sling of the Kalashnikov over her bruised shoulder and nodded once. "I can fight," she said. "Good," Brill replied. He turned his face toward the dark, sprawling silhouette of the city in the distance. "We have a train to catch." Chapter 17. The Minsk Passagersky Industrial Rail siding sat on the eastern edge of the city, a sprawling, desolate graveyard of Soviet-era logistics. Massive, rust-eaten freight cars sat on parallel tracks, stretching into the black distance like the ribs of some colossal decaying beast. The wind whipped off the frozen plains, driving thick, wet snow horizontally across the rail yard. The flakes hissed against the chilled steel of the train cars and piled high on the creosote-soaked wooden ties. Brill and Sarah moved through the perimeter fence, slipping through a gap sheared into the rusted chain link. The ambient light was terrible. Sickly yellow sodium bulbs burned high on staggered wooden utility poles, casting long, warped shadows that danced wildly in the blowing snow. The air smelled of diesel exhaust, old grease, and the sharp, metallic bite of ozone. Brill took point. He moved with the fluid, predatory silence of a hunting cat, his boots finding the heavy wooden ties to avoid the loud crunch of the frozen ballast stones. He kept his suppressed pistol raised, scanning the narrow corridors between the lines of stationary boxcars. Sarah followed 5 paces back. Her limp was severe. The freezing temperature exacerbated the trauma in her leg, tightening the damaged muscle tissue into a hard, agonizing knot. She carried the scavenged Kalashnikov tight across her chest, using the sling to support the weight, her teeth clenched against the pain. They navigated the maze of steel. Track 1. Track 2. Track 3. Brill halted abruptly, raising a closed fist. Sarah stopped instantly, melting into the deep shadow cast by the corrugated side of a grain hopper. 30 yards ahead, a towering floodlight illuminated a wide clearing between Track 8 and Track 9. Brill dropped to a low crouch, peering around the heavy steel wheels of a flatbed car. He found the transfer point. A decommissioned, heavy-duty maintenance locomotive sat idling on Track 9. The deep, rhythmic thrum of its massive diesel engine vibrated through the frozen ground. Attached to the locomotive was a single, reinforced boxcar with its heavy sliding doors hauled wide open. Brill scanned the immediate area, logging the tactical assets and threats. 12 heavily armed men formed a loose, sweeping perimeter around the idling train. They wore pristine winter combat fatigues, white and gray camouflage patterns designed for urban snow environments. They carried modern, suppressed assault rifles. They moved with the crisp, disciplined coordination of Tier 1 operators, Spetsnaz veterans. In the center of the illuminated clearing stood 2 figures. The first was Director Volkov. He looked pale and diminished. His right arm was secured in a heavy medical sling across his chest, the result of Brill's baton strike in the interrogation room. He wore a thick, fur-lined greatcoat, his breath pluming in the harsh light as he spoke. The second man stood with his back to the locomotive. He wore an expensive, charcoal gray wool topcoat over a tailored suit, wholly unsuited for the freezing Belarusian night. He held a large, heavy-duty aluminum briefcase in his left hand. Sarah crept forward, sliding in beside Brill. She peered through the snow. Her breathing hitched, a sharp intake of freezing air. "That's him," she whispered, her voice tight with raw adrenaline and sudden, crystalline hatred. "My handler. Section Chief Miller." Brill observed the American. Miller shifted his weight, stamping his expensive leather shoes against the frozen ground to ward off the cold. He looked nervous, his eyes darting toward the shadows beyond the floodlights. Behind Volkov, 2 Spetsnaz operators dragged heavy wooden crates to the edge of the boxcar. They used pry bars to splinter the lids open. Brill recognized the olive drab casing resting inside the wooden packing material. FGM-148 Javelin launch tubes. Top-tier, fire-and-forget anti-tank hardware. There were dozens of crates stacked deep inside the train car. It was enough firepower to outfit a small insurgency. Volkov gestured toward the open crates with his good arm, speaking in rapid Russian. Miller nodded, stepping forward to place the aluminum briefcase flat on a stack of wooden pallets. Brill assessed the layout. Engaging the target directly on the ground level meant pushing through 12 Spetsnaz veterans in an open illuminated kill zone. It was a suicide run. He needed elevation. He needed overwatch. He scanned the vertical plane. 50 yards down the track, a massive rusted gantry crane loomed over the rail yard. It was a towering structure of bolted iron girders, designed to lift shipping containers onto flatbed cars. A small, glass-enclosed operator's cab sat perched at the very top, 80 feet above the ground. Brill looked back at the perimeter guards. The closest Spetsnaz operator stood on the roof of a nearby train car, holding a long, distinctive rifle silhouette. An SVD Dragunov sniper rifle. The guard was scanning the distant tree line, completely unaware of the threat operating inside the wire. Brill turned to Sarah. He unholstered his primary suppressed pistol and held it out grip first. "Take this," Brill commanded. "It makes less noise than the rifle. Suppress your visual profile." Sarah lowered the Kalashnikov, letting it hang on the sling, and accepted the pistol. Her hands were shaking from the cold, but her grip on the polymer frame was solid. "I am acquiring that long rifle," Brill stated, pointing toward the sniper on the boxcar roof. "Then I am taking the crane. I will have total overwatch of the transfer. You move to the gap between those two tanker cars." He pointed to a narrow choke point 30 yards away, near the edge of the floodlights. "Hold that position. Cover the ground exit. If Miller breaks for the perimeter, you put him down." "What about Volkov?" Sarah asked, her eyes fixed on the KGB director. "Volkov is mine," Brill said. He left her in the shadows, moving out with complete, silent intent. He stalked the sniper on the boxcar roof. The operator was positioned near the rear edge of the train car, focused entirely on the outer perimeter. Brill climbed the frozen iron ladder on the opposite end of the car, his gloves gripping the rungs with terrifying silent strength. He crested the roof. The wind howled up here, tearing at his jacket, masking any small sound of his approach. Brill closed the distance in 5 rapid, sprinting strides over the corrugated steel roof. He lunged. He wrapped his left forearm around the sniper's throat, crushing the windpipe instantly, while his right hand seized the barrel of the Dragunov, ripping it forcefully from the man's grip. Brill dragged the dying operator backward, lowering him silently to the icy roof to prevent a heavy, echoing thud. Brill checked the stolen weapon. The SVD was heavy, cold, and meticulously maintained. He checked the action, ensuring a round was seated in the chamber. He clicked the fire selector down. He slung the long rifle across his back and moved toward the gantry crane. The base of the crane was a labyrinth of thick, rusted support columns. Brill found the primary access ladder. The iron rungs were coated in a thick, slick layer of black ice. He began to climb. The wind battered him, threatening to tear him from the exposed ladder. His muscles burned, fueled by adrenaline and sheer, unyielding willpower. He climbed 80 feet straight up into the freezing dark. He reached the operator's cab. The door was rusted open, groaning on its hinges. He stepped inside the cramped, glass-enclosed box. The wind screamed through the broken windows. Brill dropped to one knee, resting the heavy barrel of the Dragunov on the edge of a shattered window frame. He looked through the Paseo 1 telescopic sight, tuning the focal ring. The transfer point snapped into sharp, magnified focus. Down below, Miller popped the twin steel latches on the aluminum briefcase. He threw the lid back. Through the scope, Brill saw stacks of high-denomination bearer bonds wrapped in crisp paper bands. Millions of dollars in untraceable currency. Volkov leaned forward, inspecting the payment. The KGB director smiled, a thin, predatory curve of his lips. He reached out with his good hand, gesturing for Miller to close the case. The deal was finalized. Brill settled the crosshairs directly over the bridge of Miller's nose. He controlled his breathing. Inhale. Exhale. He preloaded the heavy trigger of the sniper rifle, taking up the slack in the sear. 80 feet below, the situation fractured. Brill kept his right eye glued to the scope, but his left eye remained open, tracking the macro environment. He watched a two-man Spetsnaz patrol break off from the main perimeter sweep. They moved off the ballast stones and onto the concrete access path, their boots crunching loudly in the snow. They were walking directly toward the narrow gap between the two tanker cars. They were walking directly toward Sarah's position. Brill shifted the rifle barrel, swinging the heavy weapon to track the patrol. The Spetsnaz guards were moving casually, their weapons held at low ready. They were simply seeking shelter from the biting wind, moving into the alleyway between the massive steel tanks to light a cigarette. Sarah was backed flush against the freezing steel of the tanker car, holding Brill's suppressed pistol with both hands. Her injured leg gave out slightly, causing her boot to scrape against a piece of rusted scrap metal on the ground. The sound was microscopic, but in the tense, isolated quiet of the rail yard, it was a siren. The lead Spetsnaz guard stopped. He dropped his cigarette. He raised his suppressed rifle, thumbing the safety off, and clicked on a high-intensity tactical flashlight mounted to the rail of his weapon. The blinding white beam cut through the blowing snow, sweeping the narrow gap. The light hit Sarah, illuminating her pale, bruised face and the pistol in her hands. The guard didn't hesitate. He opened his mouth and roared a warning into the freezing night, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel of the boxcars. Contact. In the center of the rail yard, Miller slammed the briefcase shut, his head snapping toward the shout in sheer panic. Volkov immediately dove behind the heavy wooden crates of javelins. The remaining 10 Spetsnaz operators raised their weapons, swarming toward the gap. Chapter 18. The shout of the Spetsnaz guard shattered the freezing quiet of the rail yard. High in the operator's cab of the gantry crane, Brill shoved the heavy Dragunov sniper rifle away from the shattered window frame. The weapon was a precision instrument built for distance and patience. The situation on the ground demanded absolute, kinetic brutality. He abandoned the rifle on the rusted floor grates. He lunged through the open doorway of the cab, throwing his body into the howling wind. He bypassed the frozen iron access ladder entirely. Beside the primary structural support column hung a thick braided steel industrial hoisting cable, heavily coated in frozen grease and grime. Brill wrapped his thick tactical gloves around the braided wire, crossed his heavy boots over the line to create drag, and pushed off the edge of the 80-foot platform. He plummeted. The friction instantly superheated the reinforced synthetic leather of his gloves. The smell of burning nylon and scorching grease filled his nostrils. The cold wind tore at his jacket, whipping his hood violently against his neck. He clamped his boots tighter, squeezing the heavy cable between his insteps to bleed off velocity. 10 feet above the ballast stones, he released his grip. He dropped through the darkness, bending his knees to absorb the massive kinetic impact. His boots slammed into the frozen gravel. He rolled forward over his right shoulder, dispersing the remaining downward force across his heavy winter coat, and sprang instantly to his feet. He drew his combat knife. The 8-inch slab of high-carbon steel caught the sickly amber glow of the floodlights. 30 yards away, the alley between the massive tanker cars erupted in a blinding strobe of muzzle flashes. Sarah held her ground. She fired the suppressed pistol in rapid, controlled bursts, driving the lead Spetsnaz guard back around the curve of the steel tanker. The sharp, rhythmic cough of the heavy subsonic rounds echoed over the roar of the idling locomotive. The Spetsnaz operators responded with overwhelming firepower. Suppressed assault rifles chattered in sustained automatic bursts. High-velocity rounds slammed into the thick steel hull of the tanker car, throwing showers of brilliant orange sparks into the blowing snow. The impacts sheared through rusted valves and access pipes, venting pressurized chemical residue into the frozen air. Brill moved toward the gunfight. He sprinted through the dark gaps between the stationary boxcars, becoming a blur of motion in the swirling snow. He flanked the advancing assault element. 4 operators stacked up behind a flatbed car, laying down suppressive fire on Sarah's position. They moved with elite, drilled precision, covering their sectors, their attention entirely focused on the trapped woman ahead of them. They left their rear exposed. Brill hit the rear guard like a freight train. He drove the heavy steel pommel of his knife directly into the base of the operator's skull, shattering the uppermost cervical vertebrae. The man dropped instantly, his nervous system instantly severed. Before the body hit the frozen gravel, Brill snatched the heavy Kalashnikov from the dying man's falling hands. He spun the weapon, catching the pistol grip, and slammed the steel folding stock tightly into his shoulder pocket. He acquired the next target. He squeezed the heavy trigger, driving a 3-round burst of 5.45 mm armor-piercing ammunition straight through the side of the second operator's rib cage. The rounds bypassed the heavy ceramic trauma plates entirely, shredding the vital organs underneath. The man collapsed backward into the snow, his weapon discharging wildly into the night sky. The remaining 2 operators in the stack spun around, their tactical flashlights cutting through the chemical smoke to illuminate Brill. Brill dropped to a knee, making himself a smaller target. He fired a sustained burst, driving the 3rd man into the rusted wheels of the flatbed car. The 4th operator charged. The man was a massive, bearded veteran, his eyes wide with adrenaline. He discarded his empty rifle, letting it drop on its tactical sling, and drew a thick, curved trench knife from his webbing. He lunged at Brill, driving the blade downward in a brutal sweeping arc aimed at the collarbone. Brill sidestepped the heavy thrust, slipping inside the man's guard. He brought the steel frame of his scavenged Kalashnikov up in a vicious block, parrying the knife arm outward. He shifted his weight forward, driving the muzzle of the hot rifle directly upward under the bearded man's jawline. He pulled the trigger once. The heavy report echoed off the train cars. The operator went limp, sliding off the barrel of the weapon to collapse into the stained snow. Brill ejected the spent magazine from the Kalashnikov, ignoring the empty brass clattering against the rails. He stripped a fresh magazine from the chest rig of the dead man at his feet, rocked it into the magwell, and racked the heavy steel bolt with a sharp, metallic clack. He moved forward, breaking out of the narrow alleys and stepping into the main clearing between Track 8 and Track 9. The transfer point was complete chaos. Volkov stood behind the heavy wooden crates of anti-tank missiles, shouting frantic, garbled orders to his surviving men. His face was pale, slick with cold sweat, his injured arm clutched tight against his chest. 6 remaining Spetsnaz operators formed a tight defensive ring around the KGB director. They spotted Brill emerging from the shadows. "Ubit ego!" Volkov screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the ghost stepping into the floodlights. "Kill him!" The operators opened fire simultaneously. Brill dove behind the colossal, steel-reinforced wheels of a grain hopper. The incoming fire chewed the wooden railroad ties to splinters and sparked violently against the iron chassis above his head. The noise was physically punishing, a deafening roar of automatic gunfire confined within the industrial canyon. Brill checked the chamber of his weapon. He had 30 rounds. He had 6 elite shooters pinning him down. A sharp, distinct change in the ambient vibration rumbled through the frozen earth beneath his boots. The massive diesel engine of the maintenance locomotive roared, spooling up to maximum RPM. A thick column of black, greasy exhaust erupted from the main stack, staining the falling snow. The heavy air brakes released with a deafening pressurized hiss that sounded like a dying beast. The heavy steel couplings between the train cars slammed together with a series of concussive crashes. The locomotive lurched forward, massive steel wheels grinding against the frozen tracks in a desperate bid for traction. The train was leaving. Brill peered around the rusted iron wheel housing. Miller stood near the accelerating boxcar. The American handler clutched the heavy aluminum briefcase tightly to his chest. His expensive wool topcoat flapped wildly in the prop wash of the massive engine. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He looked at Volkov cowering behind the crates. He looked at the swarm of heavily armed men firing blindly into the shadows. He looked at the fortune secured in his arms. Miller made his choice. He turned his back on the KGB director. He sprinted alongside the moving boxcar, his leather shoes slipping treacherously on the icy ballast stones. He reached out with his free hand, grasping the frozen iron grab handle mounted near the sliding door. He hauled his body upward, swinging his legs clear of the churning steel wheels, and threw himself onto the flat rusted deck of the train car. "Stoy!" Volkov shrieked, his voice cracking in raw fury. "Stop!" The KGB director realized the American was fleeing with the payment, leaving the illicit hardware stranded in a compromised rail yard. Volkov drew a sidearm from his coat pocket, firing wildly at the departing train car, but his offhand aim was terrible. The rounds sparked harmlessly against the thick steel hull. The distraction gave Brill his opening. He rolled out from behind the heavy steel wheels, planting his boots firmly in the snow. He shouldered the Kalashnikov, bringing the sights in line with the clustered Spetsnaz guards. He fired with cold, mechanical precision. He targeted the exposed gaps in their heavy armor, the throat, the pelvic girdle, the inner thighs. The first guard took a round through the neck and collapsed, his hands flying to his throat to stem the arterial spray. The second operator caught a burst in the hip, shattering the bone and dropping him screaming to the icy ground. The remaining 4 operators broke their defensive ring, scrambling for hard cover behind the pallets of anti-tank missiles. Brill advanced. He moved with a heavy, stalking gait, closing the distance rapidly. He fired short, controlled bursts, keeping the operators pinned behind the wooden crates. Wood chips and splinters exploded into the air as the heavy 5.45 mm rounds tore through the packing material. A Spetsnaz guard popped up from behind a crate, raising his weapon. A heavy, subsonic round punched through the side of the operator's helmet. The man collapsed back behind the crate. Brill glanced to his left. Sarah limped out from the narrow gap between the tanker cars. Her face was streaked with grease and blood, her breathing ragged, but her grip on the suppressed pistol was rock steady. She acquired a second guard, attempting to flank Brill from the right, and put 2 rounds center mass, dropping him into the snow. Brill pushed into the center of the clearing. He rounded the stacks of heavy wooden crates, clearing the hard corners. The final 2 Spetsnaz operators threw down their empty rifles. They drew heavy combat knives, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades to engage Brill in brutal close quarters. Brill slung his rifle out of the way. He drew his own heavy steel blade. The first operator lunged, driving his knife forward in a rapid, pumping motion aimed at Brill's abdomen. Brill parried the strike with his left forearm, taking the glancing cut on the reinforced nylon of his winter jacket. He trapped the man's knife arm, twisted his hips to generate maximum leverage, and drove his own blade deeply into the soft tissue under the operator's armpit, severing the brachial artery. The man slumped, his eyes glazing over instantly. Brill ripped the blade free and spun to face the final threat. The last guard swung a heavy, looping backhand cut. Brill ducked beneath the flashing steel, stepping inside the man's guard. He drove his knee brutally into the operator's groin, doubling the man over in sudden agony. Brill stepped behind the gasping guard, hooking his left arm under the chin, and drove the combat knife squarely between the man's shoulder blades, piercing the heart. He lowered the final body to the blood-soaked snow. The clearing fell silent, save for the howling wind and the rhythmic, accelerating chug of the departing locomotive. Brill stood amidst the carnage. He wiped the heavy steel blade on the jacket of a dead guard and sheathed it. He looked toward the wooden crates. Director Volkov was gone. The KGB chief had used the chaotic melee to slip away into the dark labyrinth of the rail yard. Brill turned his attention down the tracks. The maintenance locomotive was picking up speed, its massive headlight cutting a yellow cone through the blowing snow. The attached boxcar rumbled heavily over the joints in the rails. Sarah hobbled forward, coming to a halt beside Brill. She stared down the tracks, her jaw clenched tight. "He has the money," Sarah rasped, pointing toward the receding red taillights of the train. "He's going to cross the border and vanish." Brill looked at the accelerating freight train. He checked the action on his scavenged Kalashnikov. "Hold this position," Brill instructed, his voice a flat, dead calm amidst the swirling snow. "Secure the hardware. Wait for the extraction team." He broke into a heavy sprint, his boots churning the frozen ballast stones, chasing down the accelerating train. Chapter 19. The diesel locomotive roared, a massive mechanical beast tearing a hole through the freezing Belarusian night. Black, oily exhaust plumed from the primary stack, instantly ripped away by the howling wind. Brill sprinted across the frozen rail yard. The heavy, uneven ballast stones shifted treacherously beneath his tactical boots. His lungs burned, pulling in jagged lungfuls of sub-zero air. The muscles in his thighs screamed, flooded with lactic acid from the close-quarters slaughter in the clearing, but he pushed his body to accelerate. The final boxcar of the train rumbled past him, gaining velocity with every passing second. Brill focused entirely on the rusted iron ladder welded to the rear corner of the heavy steel car. He tracked its forward movement, timing his own intercept path. He closed the gap. 10 yards. 5. He lunged. He launched his entire body weight across the empty space, his heavy winter coat flapping violently in the prop wash of the accelerating train. His leather-gloved hands slammed into the frozen iron rungs of the ladder. The kinetic shock was brutal. The forward momentum of the train threatened to rip his arms from their shoulder sockets. His boots slammed against the heavy steel plating of the boxcar, his knees bending deeply to absorb the punishing impact. He held on, his fingers locking around the ice-coated iron with a crushing, unbreakable grip. He hung suspended over the blurring ground, the wind screaming in his ears, the deafening clatter of the steel wheels grinding against the tracks directly beneath his boots. He hauled himself upward, hand over hand, rung by rusted rung. He crested the edge of the boxcar and pulled himself onto the roof. The environment at the top of the train was an immediate, hostile assault. The wind was no longer a howl. It was a physical wall of moving air, driving tiny jagged crystals of sleet horizontally across the flat expanse of the car. The roof itself was constructed of corrugated steel, entirely coated in a thick, smooth sheet of black ice. Standing upright was a physical impossibility. The wind would catch his heavy coat and throw him into the darkness. Brill dropped to his hands and knees. He pressed his chest flat against the freezing steel, spreading his weight to maximize his surface area. He holstered his scavenged Kalashnikov, securing it tightly against his back. He needed both hands. He began to crawl. The train banked into a long, sweeping curve. The heavy boxcar shuddered and bucked beneath him, the metal groaning in protest. Brill dug the reinforced toes of his boots into the shallow grooves of the corrugated roof, using his fingertips to find tiny imperfections in the ice to pull himself forward. It was a slow, agonizing process. The cold seeped through his tactical gloves, numbing his fingers, turning his hands into stiff, unfeeling claws. He reached the front edge of the first boxcar. A 4-foot gap of empty air separated him from the next car in the line. Below the gap, the heavy steel couplings clashed and ground together with terrifying, bone-rattling violence. Brill pushed himself up into a low crouch. He fought the wind, adjusting his balance against the swaying motion of the train. He focused on the flat, icy edge of the adjacent roof. He launched himself across the void. He landed heavily on his chest, sliding 3 feet across the ice before his boots caught a rusted seam in the metal, arresting his forward momentum. He resumed his crawl. He repeated the grueling process across 3 more identical boxcars. The physical toll was immense. His muscles shook with exhaustion and the biting cold, but his mind remained a cold, isolated engine driving him forward. The mission required the asset. The handler possessed the payment. The payment finalized the pipeline. He crossed the 4th gap, landing on the roof of a specialized transport car. This roof was not flat. It featured a recessed central catwalk made of heavy iron grating, flanked by massive cylindrical ventilation units. Brill dropped into the recessed catwalk, gaining immediate shelter from the punishing crosswind. The iron grating provided solid traction for his boots. He drew his suppressed Sig Sauer pistol, keeping the muzzle pointed down, and moved forward in a low, rapid crouch. He spotted the target. Section Chief Miller huddled in the deep shadow behind the 2nd ventilation unit. The CIA handler had his expensive wool topcoat pulled tightly around his neck, shivering violently in the freezing air. He clutched the heavy aluminum briefcase tight to his chest, his knuckles white. Miller heard the soft crunch of Brill's boots on the iron grating. The handler spun around, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. He fumbled inside his topcoat, drawing a compact silver-plated pistol. Brill closed the distance before Miller could raise the weapon. He drove his left forearm outward, striking Miller's wrist with a sharp, paralyzing blow. The silver pistol clattered harmlessly onto the iron grating and slid away into the darkness. Simultaneously, Brill's right hand shot forward, grasping the lapels of Miller's coat. He slammed the handler brutally against the heavy steel casing of the ventilation unit. The impact knocked the breath from Miller's lungs in a loud, ragged gasp. The aluminum briefcase slipped from his grasp, landing heavily on the catwalk. "Wait," Miller choked out, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate terror. He stared into Brill's flat, unreadable gray eyes. "Wait. You don't understand. The agency, they don't care about this hardware. It's untraceable. We can make a deal." Brill applied pressure to the man's throat, pinning him tighter against the cold steel. "I have $5 million in bearer bonds in that case," Miller wheezed, spit flying from his lips as he struggled for air. "It's clean money. No serial numbers. No tracking. You take half. We walk away. We both disappear." Brill ignored the offer. A compromised handler was a loose end. A man willing to sell top-tier NATO hardware and burn his own NOC agent to secure a payday was a disease. The mission parameters dictated a complete sanitization of the site. He released his grip on Miller's throat and stepped back a half-pace. Miller misinterpreted the movement. He thought he had found the ghost price. A relieved, sickening smile began to form on his bruised face. Brill drove the heavy, steel-reinforced toe of his tactical boot directly into the side of Miller's right knee. The impact carried the force of a swinging sledgehammer. The joint ruptured with a loud, wet snap that cut clearly through the roar of the train. The lateral collateral ligament tore completely. Miller screamed, a high, piercing sound of absolute agony. His right leg buckled instantly, refusing to support his weight. Before the handler could collapse, Brill struck again. He delivered a brutal, downward stomp to the shin of Miller's left leg. The tibia bone fractured under the crushing pressure. Miller went down, crashing hard onto the iron grating, his hands clawing uselessly at his ruined legs. The arrogant, untouchable architect of the arms pipeline was reduced to a weeping, broken animal on the floor of a freezing train car. Brill knelt beside him. He ignored the man's screams. He unspooled a length of high-tensile Kevlar cord from his wrist pouch. He grabbed Miller's thrashing wrists, forcing them behind the ventilation pipe, and lashed them tightly to the heavy iron grating. He secured the knots with ruthless efficiency, ensuring the handler could not move an inch. Miller was completely immobilized, a permanent fixture bound to the accelerating train. The Belarusian border guards would find him at the crossing, a crippled American spy surrounded by illicit hardware. His life as a free man was over. Brill stood up. He picked up the heavy aluminum briefcase by its rubberized handle. The final piece of the puzzle was secure. He turned to make his way back across the train, planning his exit strategy. A heavy, metallic screech echoed over the wind. 30 feet ahead, the access door leading to the adjacent passenger car slid open. A flood of harsh, yellow interior light spilled out onto the dark, icy catwalk. A massive silhouette stepped into the doorway. Director Volkov stood framed in the light. The head of the Belarusian KGB had shed his heavy fur greatcoat. His dress uniform was torn and stained with dark blood. His right arm hung uselessly in its heavy medical sling, a testament to Brill's earlier work in the interrogation room. But his left hand was functional. Volkov held a compact, brutal AKS-74U assault rifle. He rested the heavy barrel on the edge of the open doorway, stabilizing the weapon with his single good hand, leveling the sights directly at Brill's chest. The director's face was a mask of cold, unadulterated hatred. He had watched his empire crumble, his men slaughtered, and his payment stolen. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. Brill stood perfectly still in the center of the narrow catwalk, the heavy briefcase in one hand, the suppressed pistol in the other. He stared down the dark barrel of the raised rifle, the freezing wind howling through the narrow space between them. Chapter 20. Director Volkov burst through the heavy iron door of the trailing boxcar. The KGB chief stepped onto the violently swaying gangway platform, his face pale, his eyes wide with desperate rage. He raised a compact AKS-74U assault rifle with his good left hand, bracing the heavy steel stock clumsily against his hip. Muzzle flashes strobed brilliant white and yellow against the blowing snow. Brill dropped flat against the rusted iron grating of the walkway. The high-velocity 5.45 mm rounds tore through the freezing air exactly where his chest had been a microsecond earlier. They slammed into the heavy steel bulkhead behind him, sparking violently and spraying red-hot fragments of metal into the night. The deafening, mechanical roar of the automatic gunfire competed with the shrieking wind and the heavy rhythmic pounding of the locomotive's wheels against the tracks. Volkov fired wildly. His shattered right arm, locked tight inside a makeshift medical sling, ruined his recoil management. The short-barreled rifle bucked viciously in his single-handed grip, sending a spray of lead high into the dark sky. He relied on pure panic and volume, sweeping the barrel back and forth across the narrow gap between the cars. Brill scrambled forward on his belly, his heavy winter coat scraping against the frosted metal deck. He moved beneath the erratic stream of suppressing fire, using the heavy iron coupling mechanism below the grating for hard cover. He crawled toward the edge of the platform, closing the distance while Volkov dumped the remainder of his magazine into the dark. The AKS-74U clicked empty. The heavy steel bolt locked to the rear with a sharp, distinct clack. Volkov gasped, his breath pluming in terrified ragged clouds. He fumbled desperately at his tactical webbing with his one good hand, clawing for a fresh magazine. Brill rose from the grating. He stepped smoothly over the thrashing, whimpering form of Miller, who remained tightly bound to the railing by industrial zip ties. Volkov dropped the empty rifle. It clattered loudly against the iron deck. He reached for the heavy leather holster strapped to his belt, drawing a standard-issue Makarov pistol. Brill crossed the narrow gap in two massive driving strides. He brought his left forearm up in a brutal sweeping block, striking Volkov's wrist just as the pistol cleared the leather holster. The bone-jarring impact instantly shattered Volkov's grip. The handgun spun away into the darkness, swallowed completely by the rushing blizzard. Brill drew his combat knife. He drove his right hand forward in a short, devastating thrust, putting his entire body weight behind the motion. The 8-inch slab of high-carbon steel punched through the thick fur-lined fabric of Volkov's winter greatcoat. It bypassed the heavy ribs and slid flawlessly into the left ventricle of the KGB director's heart. Volkov froze. His eyes widened, reflecting the harsh ambient yellow light of the distant rail yard fading behind them. He looked down at the heavy black hilt of the knife protruding from his chest. Brill twisted the blade sharply to ensure total organ failure. He ripped the steel free, stepping back to avoid the arterial spray. Volkov collapsed onto the icy gangway plates. A massive pool of dark, steaming blood instantly spread across the rusted iron, freezing solid almost as quickly as it hit the frigid metal. Brill turned away from the corpse. He wiped the heavy blade clean on his ruined, soot-stained jacket and slid it securely back into his Kydex sheath. He looked down at Miller. The rogue CIA handler hung against the heavy iron railing, secured tight by the plastic restraints. Both of the handler's legs hung at unnatural, ruined postures, shattered during Brill's initial breach of the platform. Miller stared at Volkov's dead body, his face drained of all color, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. The massive freight train suddenly lurched. A deafening, high-pitched squeal of iron on iron tore through the night air as the locomotive's heavy air brakes engaged. The violent deceleration threw sparks in massive showering arcs from the wheels below them. Brill looked ahead down the tracks. 2 miles in the distance, a sprawling array of high-intensity stadium floodlights carved a stark, brilliant white line across the black Belarusian forest. The Lithuanian border crossing. Miller recognized the lights. He realized the absolute finality of his situation. The aluminum briefcase full of untraceable bearer bonds lay at his broken feet, stained heavily with Volkov's blood. The border guards would swarm the train. They would find him secured to the railing, alongside a dead KGB director. The CIA would immediately disavow him, erasing his files and severing all ties. The Belarusian government would claim him as a hostile foreign spy, stripping him of any diplomatic immunity. He faced the rest of his life rotting in a subterranean black site, subjected to the very interrogation techniques he had authorized others to use. Miller opened his mouth. He screamed over the roaring wind, shouting desperate promises of wealth, begging for mercy, offering up global intelligence assets in exchange for a knife to cut his bonds. Brill ignored the words. He stepped to the extreme outer edge of the moving platform. The train ground down to 30 miles per hour, the massive steel wheels fighting the immense momentum of the heavy cargo cars. The wind whipped violently across the exposed gangway, tearing at Brill's clothes. He judged the passing terrain. A steep, snow-covered embankment sloped sharply away from the elevated tracks, diving deep into a thick, black stand of old-growth pine trees. The deep powder offered a narrow margin of survival. He grabbed the exterior iron handrail with both gloved hands. He vaulted his legs over the side, hung suspended for a fraction of a second, and threw his body into the freezing void. He hit the embankment with brutal, bone-jarring force. The deep, powdery snow absorbed a fraction of the initial shock, but the kinetic energy of a body moving at 30 miles per hour demanded a toll. Brill tucked his chin tightly to his chest, wrapping his arms around his head to protect his skull, and rolled aggressively down the steep incline. The world blurred into a chaotic, spinning centrifuge of stark white snow and black timber. He crashed violently through a heavy thicket of frozen, dormant brush, snapping branches like dry bones, and slammed to a complete halt against the massive base of a towering oak tree. Brill lay perfectly still in the deep snow for 10 seconds. He inventoried his body, scanning his central nervous system for critical failures. Heavily bruised ribs on the left side. A deep, bleeding laceration on his right thigh. Mild frostnip spreading across his exposed cheeks. Minor joint trauma in the shoulders. He remained fully combat effective. He stood up slowly, shaking the heavy clumps of snow from his tactical webbing. He turned his back to the elevated tracks, listening to the screeching brakes of the train fade into the distance, and walked deep into the silent forest. The predetermined extraction point sat 3 miles north of the rail corridor. Brill navigated the dense, unfamiliar woodland entirely by terrain association, tracking the natural ridges, the flow of the frozen streams, and the subtle shifts in elevation. The howling wind finally died down as the darkest hour of the night passed. The sky began to bruise purple and deep slate gray in the east. The forest stood in absolute frozen silence, providing a sharp, jarring contrast to the deafening industrial roar of the rail yard and the chaotic gunfight. He reached an abandoned forester's cabin, nestled deep in a shallow, snow-choked ravine. The wooden roof had collapsed under the weight of heavy snowfall decades ago. Only 3 stacked stone walls remained standing, covered entirely in a thick, glittering blanket of frost. Sarah stood deep in the darkest shadow of the ruined stone chimney. She held her scavenged Kalashnikov at the low ready, her finger resting lightly just outside the trigger guard. Her clothes were torn to shreds, soaked through with freezing sewer water and dried blood. Her face was a patchwork of deep purple bruises and open cuts, but her posture remained locked in rigid, disciplined resolve. She watched Brill emerge silently from the heavy tree line. She recognized his gait, lowering the weapon and engaging the heavy steel safety selector with a sharp, metallic click. "The handler?" she asked, her voice a harsh, rasping whisper echoing off the stones. "He is currently crossing the border tied to a freight car," Brill stated, stepping into the meager shelter of the ruined walls. "The border guards will process him. Your agency will receive the international police reports within 48 hours." Sarah nodded slowly. She processed the stark, tactical reality. Miller would burn in the geopolitical fallout. The illicit arms pipeline was entirely dismantled. Volkov was dead on the floor plates. "And the hardware?" she asked, shifting her weight off her severely injured leg. "Secured," Brill answered. "The train is stopped at the checkpoint. Local authorities will impound the cargo." He knelt in the snow and retrieved a thick, insulated mylar thermal blanket from his remaining gear pack, which he had hidden beneath a fallen, hollowed-out log prior to the rail yard assault. He tossed the silver package to her. She tore it open and wrapped the foil tightly around her shivering shoulders, trapping her remaining body heat. Brill pointed toward a narrow, snow-choked game trail leading north through the timber. "Lithuania is 2 miles that way," Brill said. "A secondary safe house awaits just past the tree line. Armed transport vehicles. Full medical support. Secure satellite communications back to Langley." They walked. They moved in absolute silence, putting distance between themselves and the carnage of Minsk. The rising sun finally crested the distant horizon, casting long, pale beams of golden light through the frosted pine branches. The snow crunched rhythmically beneath their heavy boots, a steady, hypnotic metronome marking their survival. 5,000 miles away, the bright morning sun warmed the manicured, pristine lawns of Washington, D.C. Shelby Johnson sat comfortably in the back of his heavily armored Cadillac, nursing a ceramic cup of black, bitter coffee. The heavy vehicle idled smoothly in the dense commuter traffic of the Capitol Beltway. The climate control system pumped dry, perfectly heated air into the quiet, leather-lined cabin, completely isolating him from the crisp autumn chill outside. Shelby watched the Potomac River roll past the reinforced glass. He held a thick, heavily encrypted burn-after-reading satellite phone resting lightly in his right palm. The device vibrated once. A short, sharp, mechanical buzz. Shelby tapped the screen, entering a complex biometric bypass to unlock the operating system. A single, heavily masked text message populated the secure inbox. The routing data showed the signal bouncing rapidly through a dozen untraceable dummy servers scattered across Eastern Europe before finally hitting his handheld device. The message contained exactly 2 words. "Account closed." Shelby read the words, committing the success of the mission to memory. He locked the phone screen, rolled down the heavily tinted window a fraction of an inch, and dropped the expensive device directly into a customized acid-filled disposal chute built flush into the door panel. The phone hissed, dissolving entirely into toxic, untraceable slag within seconds. Shelby took a slow sip of his coffee. He reached forward and tapped the thick ballistic glass partition separating him from his driver. "Take us to Langley," Shelby ordered, his voice smooth and untroubled. "We have an emergency meeting regarding a sudden, unexpected vacancy at the Eastern European desk." Back in the frozen, silent woods of the borderland, Brill stopped at the edge of a snow-plowed, paved access road. A black, unmarked transport van sat idling in the distance, its exhaust pluming white in the freezing dawn air. Sarah limped forward, moving toward the open sliding door of the van, and the waiting team of field medics rushing out to meet her. She stopped halfway across the asphalt. She turned back toward the forest to thank the man who had pulled her out of hell. The tree line was completely empty. The end.